Tonight, I want to tell you about a choice that was never supposed to be made, and the night it was. In the Pride Lands, there is an ancient way of things. The circle of life, Mufasa called it, each creature knowing its place, each generation knowing what it owes the one before it. And at the heart of that circle is the pride itself, and at the heart of the pride is duty. Nala would have understood this from birth. She was born to be more than a mother, more than a hunter. She was born to be a queen, the complement to a king, the steadiness when the throne shook. But on the night of the stampede, the night Mufasa died, duty and love collided in the gorge, and a young lioness had to choose between them. I find myself thinking about this moment often, because it is the moment that broke everything. Not because the choice itself was wrong, but because the circumstances that forced it should never have existed at all. So let me take you back to the beginning of that night, and show you how a single decision unmade a kingdom. The day had been innocent enough. Simba and Nala, both still cubs, still young enough that the weight of the future had not yet settled properly on their shoulders, had done what all cubs do. They had broken the rules together. They had snuck away to the elephant graveyard, that strange, haunted place beyond the northern boundary where the bones of the dead lay scattered under the sun, where no lion was supposed to go. It was the kind of small rebellion that feels enormous when you are small yourself, that carries the thrill of almost getting caught, almost disappointed by the fact that you weren't. Zazu had found them eventually, as he always did, and brought them back to Pride Rock, scolding and fussy and fundamentally harmless. What Nala did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the elephant graveyard was not just a forbidden place, it was a sign. It was where Scar's hyenas lived, where the alliance had been struck, where the machinery of the coup was already turning. That stampede did not happen by accident. A lion does not choose to run at wildebeest and expect to survive, unless someone has arranged it all very carefully, unless someone wants that death to look like the natural consequence of being where a lion should not be. Scar was Mufasa's brother, the second son, the one who had been passed over for the throne when Simba was born. I think it is important to sit with that fact, because it tells you everything about what was about to happen. He had waited his whole life for a crown that would never come, and at some point, the waiting had curdled into something else. When Mufasa was alive, Scar was dangerous in the way all bitter things are, sharp, clever, capable of small cruelties dressed up as jokes. But he was also contained, held in check by a king who was loved and a system that would outlive them both. That night, he stopped being contained. The stampede began in chaos and noise, and the horrible inevitability of 1,000 animals driven wild. Mufasa died in the gorge, crushed beneath them, and in his final moments Scar whispered, "Long live the king," as if he were pronouncing a blessing instead of speaking a curse. What happened next moved very quickly. Scar found Simba in the gorge, standing in the dust beside his father's body, and he did something more terrible than killing him outright. He made Simba believe he had caused the death himself. The child had been placed in the gorge by deception, left waiting for a surprise, and when the stampede came, he could not help but think that he had caused it, that his presence had somehow brought it about. Guilt is a leash, and Scar pulled it tight. He told Simba to run, to never return, and Simba ran. The hyenas came after him, but the young cub managed to escape through a thicket of thorns too dense and too painful for them to follow, tumbling through the needle-sharp branches into a darkness they would not pursue. When the hyenas reported back to Scar, they told him the cub was dead, and Scar accepted this lie without question because it suited him, because a dead heir is infinitely less threatening than a living one. But he was wrong. Simba was alive, and he was running into the desert, and he was alone. At almost the same moment, Scar presented himself to the Pride at Pride Rock. The Queen Mother, Sarabi, was there, Mufasa's mate, the woman who had borne the heir, who understood the nature of loss better perhaps than anyone else could. Zazu was there, the major domo, the keeper of the kingdom's rhythms, the one who knew what was true and what was not. And Nala was there, a young lioness, still very much a cub, standing beside the pride she had always known, listening to the lion who had just murdered her king announce that both the king and the heir were dead, and that he was the new sovereign. Here is where I want to pause, because this is the moment where duty and choice begin to separate from each other. Nala had been born into a role. She would have known from the earliest age that her future was intertwined with Simba's, that the kingdom expected them to be partners, to continue the line, to carry forward what Mufasa had built. That is what it means to be born into duty in a place like the Pride Lands. It is not a burden you choose. It is a weight you inherit before you are old enough to understand what weight means. And she had accepted it, as one does, because what other choice was there? But when Scar announced the deaths, when the pride began to shift and reshape itself around him, something changed in Nala's understanding of what duty was and what it required of her. She did not know that Simba had survived. The hyenas had reported him dead, and Scar believed the report, and there was no reason for her to think anything different. What she knew was that Mufasa was gone, that the throne was shifting to a lion who should never have had it, and that the future she had been born into no longer existed as she had understood it. That night, in the darkness after Scar's announcement, Nala made her choice. Somewhere beyond the northern border of the Pride Lands, in the desert scrub and thorns, a young cub was running for his life, carrying guilt that was not his to carry, alone and terrified, and leaving behind everything he had ever known. And in Pride Rock, another young lion made the decision that would alter both their fates forever. She decided that duty did not mean staying, that sometimes the only way to honor what you had been born to was to leave it behind and follow the one person who still mattered. She left that night to find him. She did not know he was alive, not truly, not with the certainty that would make such a choice rational. But something in her, call it instinct, call it love, call it the wild animal sense that runs beneath all reason, something in her knew that Simba might have survived, and that if he had, he would need her more than the pride needed her, more than duty needed her. In the morning, when Scar looked for her to consolidate his power, to show the pride that everything was still under control, she would be gone. And that absence would change everything that followed. This is the night the Pride Lands lost not one heir, but two. On the night that Mufasa fell, two cubs fled into the dark, and the Pride Lands would never know peace again, because neither of them understood what the other was running from. Simba ran first, blindly, with the roar of the stampede still ringing in his ears and Scar's voice in his head like a wound. You must leave and never return, the uncle's words carrying the weight of a curse. He did not know yet that his father was dead. He only knew that his father was gone, that the gorge had taken him, that he had been the reason Mufasa came to find him in the canyon, had been the reason they were both there when the wildebeest came. The boy ran and ran, his small legs carrying him through the scrubland that bordered the Pride Lands, through grass that turned sparse and then sparser still, until the world became nothing but red earth and the distance between himself and what he had done. Behind him, the three hyenas, Shenzi, Banzai, Ed, pursued with the casual cruelty of creatures who had been given permission to hunt something they had always wished to destroy. They drove him like the stampede had driven the wildebeest, a wall of teeth and hunger pressing him toward the edge of everything he knew, and I think there is something worth sitting with there. The way the same violence repeats itself in different forms, and the young never see the pattern until it's too late. At the thorn thicket, a great thorned wall at what seemed to be the very edge of existence, the hyenas finally stopped, unable to follow him into that tangle of needle and wood. Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed returned to Pride Rock as the night deepened, bearing news to Scar that the heir of the Pride Lands was dead, crushed in the gorge where his father had fallen, and Scar's face, if he had one moment of genuine feeling in all the years that followed, might have shown something like satisfaction. What neither Scar nor the hyenas could have known was that Simba survived the thicket, that he emerged bloodied and half delirious on the far side, and that he was now walking deeper into the wasteland, away from everything that could save him. The desert took hold of him as it takes hold of any small creature that wanders into it without knowledge or protection, and he collapsed at last in the heat, his body cooling with the fall of night, utterly alone in a landscape that did not care whether he lived or died. Meanwhile, back at Pride Rock, Nala had watched from the gathered pride as Scar climbed the high stone and addressed them, his voice carrying a performance of sorrow that must have been, for him, almost enjoyable. I imagine the night was very still, the kind of still that comes after something enormous has broken, when the world is not quite ready to move again. Scar announced the deaths as though he had witnessed them himself. Mufasa, the great king, fallen in the gorge. Simba, the heir, lost in the chaos, his small body trampled beneath the herd. The pride grieved, because lions can only grieve what they believe to be true, and there was no reason for them not to believe him. But Nala was different, and I think this is the moment the story truly turns, the instant where her choice becomes possible. She was young, only a cub herself, but she had been Simba's companion, his playmate, the one who had walked with him to the elephant graveyard that very morning, the one who had run alongside him through dangers she barely understood. When Scar finished speaking, and the pride dispersed into the shadows of Pride Rock, confused and frightened, Nala did not grieve the way the others did. Instead, she felt a strange certainty move through her. Simba had survived. I do not know what in her cub's mind generated this conviction, whether it was something she remembered of his quickness, his resourcefulness, his stubborn refusal to be beaten by anything, but she knew or thought she knew, that wherever he was alive. And in that knowledge, something shifted inside her. She was meant to be the future of the Pride Lands, the female who would support the king, who would carry on the line of Mufasa and strengthen the bonds that held the pride together. Sarabi, Simba's mother and now widow, would need her. The pride would need her. Duty demanded that she remain at Pride Rock and prepare herself for that role, for a future in which she served whoever sat on the throne, whether that was Scar or, someday, if Simba somehow returned, Simba himself. But Nala, on that night when the world had tilted and emptied itself of certainty, made a choice that no one would ask her to make, that no one would even know she had made. She left. Not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony that should have accompanied the abandonment of a destiny. She simply stepped away from Pride Rock into the darkness, carrying nothing but the conviction that Simba was out there, alive in the night, and that staying to fulfill her duty would mean abandoning the one thing that now seemed to matter more than duty itself, the possibility that she could find him. It is, I think, one of the quietest rebellions, not against a tyrant, though Scar was already becoming one, but against the idea that a cub's future was more important than a cub's heart. As she moved away from the warm stones of Pride Rock, away from the known lands she had never left, the Pride lands behind her were already beginning to change. Scar had opened the gates to the hyena clan, and they were pouring in like a flood, drawn by the promise of hunting grounds where once they had been forbidden, and the land itself seemed to sense the violation. The delicate balance that Mufasa had maintained, the circle of life, whole and turning and interdependent, was already splintering. But Nala did not know this yet, or perhaps she knew it but did not care, because there was only one thing in her young mind now. Simba was alive, and she would find him, and the rest, the pride, her duty, her destiny as a future queen, would have to wait. 2 cubs fled into the darkness on that night, each carrying a different weight, each running toward something they believed might save them, and neither of them could have known that their parallel flights were the opening move of a tragedy that would span years, that would hollow out the Pride lands, that would transform everyone they knew, and that would teach them both, eventually, what it meant to want to come home when home no longer existed. Behind them, Scar took his throne, and the hyenas began to hunt, and the grass of the savannah, golden and vast and full of life only hours before, began, almost imperceptibly, to wither. The night deepened, and the kingdom entered a darkness it did not yet understand it had chosen. In the heat of the afternoon, when the sun had nearly finished burning through the sky, Timon the meerkat found himself doing what he did most days, wandering through the scrub with his friend Pumba, talking about nothing in particular and trying not to think about the meerkat colony that had decided, long ago, that he didn't belong there. Timon's ideas were too big for a meerkat, the colony elders had said. He thought too much about the world beyond the burrows, questioned too many of their traditions, suggested too many things that made the other meerkats uncomfortable. So he had left, or been asked to leave. The distinction had blurred over time, and found himself in the company of a warthog who had his own reasons for living far from anywhere that mattered. Pumba, for all his gentleness, carried a burden that other animals found impossible to overlook, a digestive system that made social gatherings, shall we say, untenable. He was kind and thoughtful and loyal to a fault, but his own kind had made it clear that his presence was somehow more offensive than his absence could ever remedy. The two of them had found each other, as outcasts do, and built a small life in the lush edges of the jungle where the rules of their former worlds seemed not to apply. And then one afternoon, as the heat was beginning to break and the sun was starting its slow descent, Pumba came across something collapsed in the dust at the jungle's edge. A lion cub, unconscious and barely breathing, with the thorn marks of the wasteland still visible across his flanks. Timon's first instinct, I should tell you, was to leave him there. A lion was a predator, and predators killed things, and Timon had spent his whole life learning to be wary of the larger world. But Pumba saw something else. He saw a living creature in distress, and more practically, he saw a protector. A lion, Pumba thought, could keep them safe. So Pumba insisted, in the way that only Pumba could insist, not with force or anger, but with a quiet certainty that suggested this was simply the right thing to do, and Timon, who had learned that his friend's intuitions were often better than his own caution, agreed. They brought the cub to their home, a place deep in the jungle where the canopy was so thick that the sun arrived only in dappled patches, and where a small stream ran year-round, cool and clear. When Simba woke, he was alive in a place that seemed designed to be impossible, an oasis so green and abundant that it felt like a hallucination brought on by too much sun and too much fear. Around him moved creatures that should have no reason to associate with a lion, let alone tend to one's fever with leaves soaked in cold water and gentle words. Timon was the first to speak, in that rapid, nervous way of his, as though words were a defense against the weight of what might happen if he paused to think. He told Simba about Hakuna Matata, a phrase that Timon seemed to believe held within it an entire philosophy, an entire way of being in the world. It meant no worries, Timon explained, not in the sense of heedlessness, though there was some of that, but in the sense of release, of choosing not to carry the weight of everything that had happened before. There's a particular kind of mercy in that kind of forgetting, you understand, though it is not quite the same thing as healing. Pumba, sitting beside the recovering cub with something like gentleness radiating from him, explained it differently. He spoke of bugs, specifically, and the abundance of them in the jungle. Grubs, he said, were particularly good, plump, juicy things that were nothing like the gazelles Simba's body was programmed to hunt, but which sustained life all the same. Beetles, too, and slugs the size of a cub's paw, and things with names that Simba had never heard, all of which existed in such quantity that one need never go hungry. The stars came out that first night, and Simba, lying on his back with Pumba's warm flank beside him and Timon curled nearby, asked what they were. Timon, being Timon, made a joke. They were fireflies, he said, that had gotten stuck up in a big bluish-black something, and if one had enough time and patience, one could probably work out the mechanism. Pumba, whose gentleness extended to his astronomy, offered a quieter alternative. They were, he said, giant balls of gas burning billions of miles away, and he said it with such certainty that one felt he might have read it somewhere, or perhaps simply thought about it long enough to arrive at the truth. Simba looked up at those distant fires and felt something shift inside himself, not toward peace, but toward a kind of forgetting that felt, at least for a moment, like peace might feel. I find myself thinking about what happened in those first weeks, about how quickly a young mind can learn to redirect its attention away from what it cannot bear to feel. Simba's grief was still there, of course. It didn't vanish simply because he had stopped looking directly at it, but it became something he learned to carry without acknowledging, the way one might carry a heavy stone in one's pocket without ever reaching down to feel its weight. The jungle itself seemed designed for this particular kind of forgetting. It was so abundant, so alive, so entirely present in every moment, that the past became difficult to access, the way a memory from another country becomes difficult to remember once you've surrounded yourself entirely with new sensations. Days began to blur together in a way that was, if not exactly happiness, at least not unhappiness. Timon and Pumbaa taught Simba to laugh, or rather, they taught him that laughing was something one could choose to do, a kind of control he could exert over the weight of being alive. They taught him that friendship was not something that required the bonds of blood or duty, but something that could emerge between the most unlikely creatures, simply because those creatures had chosen to stay together. And Simba, in those early weeks, began to grow accustomed to the idea that he might be able to continue living without ever having to look backward again. It was, I think, a beautiful deception, and like all beautiful deceptions, it required a great deal of maintenance to keep standing. Behind them, unmeasured weeks away, the Pride Lands were beginning to show the first visible scars of Scar's unopposed rule, and Nala, if she was still alive, if she was still searching, would not find what she was looking for. But in the jungle, under the vast abundance of stars, Simba was learning to pretend that none of that mattered, that the world began and ended with Timon's jokes and Pumbaa's kindness, and the taste of grubs, and the feeling of being warm and fed, and for the first time since that terrible night, safe. Months into hiding, Nala had still not learned how to stop listening for the sound of Pride Rock in the dark. Every night in the jungle, some small noise, a branch falling, a distant rumble, would pull her awake with her body already half risen, expecting to see the silhouette of the stone outcrop against the stars. It never came, of course, and that was the hardest part. The repetition of that small disappointment, the muscle memory of longing that her mind could not quite train away. Simba, in those first months, seemed to be learning something very different, how to stop listening altogether. You could see it in the way he would sit with Timon and Pumbaa in the warm afternoons, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and deliberate, as though he were learning to empty himself on purpose. He had begun to laugh again, which should have been a comfort to her, and in quiet moments it was, but there was something in the quality of that laughter that troubled her in a way she could not quite name. It was the laughter of someone who had decided, very carefully, not to remember. Nala, by contrast, could not stop remembering, and it was eating her alive in small, quiet ways that no one else could see. When Timon would bring her food, insects, grubs, the strange bounty of the jungle, she would eat mechanically, her mind elsewhere, and she noticed that the warthog watched her with a kind of sad recognition, as though he understood what it meant to carry weight that no one asked you to carry. Pumbaa was gentler with her than Timon was, never pushing, never suggesting that she adopt his philosophy of Hakuna Matata, which she had come to understand meant no worries, a phrase that seemed to her almost obscene in its simplicity. No worries, she thought, as if the Pride Lands were not dying. As if the kingdom she had been born to serve was not being consumed from within by forces she had fled. As if her mother, Seraphina, was not still there, waiting, unaware that her daughter had abandoned her. There was a night, perhaps 6 weeks into their hiding, when she finally said something to Simba about it. They were sitting apart from Timon and Pumbaa, near the edge of the jungle where the stars were visible through the leaves, and she had been watching him in the darkness. This boy who had been her dearest friend, her betrothed, the heir to everything they both knew. He looked taller already, she realized, his features lengthening toward the adult he would become, and there was a peace in his face that broke something in her when she saw it. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked quietly, not looking at him directly because she was afraid of what she might see in his answer. Simba was quiet for a very long time, and in that silence she felt something shift between them, some small seismic settling. "No," he said finally, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only honesty. "I've stopped." The words landed like stones in still water, and Nala felt the ripples move through her. He was not being unkind, she understood that, but he was being truthful, and the truth was that her betrothed, the cub who had once cried against her shoulder in the nursery after his father corrected him too harshly, had decided to become someone who did not grieve. And perhaps that was wise, she thought bitterly. Perhaps that was the only way to survive this. But she could not do it, and she was beginning to understand that this difference between them, his capacity for forgetting and her inability to forget, was going to be the real divide between them, larger than any jungle, deeper than any water. What gnawed at her in the long afternoons, when the heat pressed down and the jungle seemed to slow into something like stillness, was not the immediate loss of her home, but something more abstract and somehow more unbearable, the loss of who she was supposed to become. Nala's name meant the successful one, the gift, and that naming had never felt arbitrary to her, never been mere ceremony. It had been a promise and a responsibility, whispered into the world on the day of her presentation to the Pride, and she had accepted it as naturally as she had accepted her lungs, her legs, her fierce, quick mind. She was going to be queen. Not as a reward, not as a trophy, but as a duty, as a purpose woven into the very structure of who she was, and what the circle of life demanded of her. The lionesses of the Pride lands, her mother first among them, had been training her toward that role since she could stand, teaching her the patience it took to hold a pride together, the wisdom it took to counsel a king, the strength it took to hunt and lead and endure. And she had walked away from it. The choice had felt inevitable in the moment. Simba was alive. Simba needed her. The alternative was to remain in Pride Rock under Scar's shadow, waiting to be claimed as a prize or a tool. But months later, in the heat of the jungle, it began to feel less like salvation and more like abandonment. She did not regret choosing Simba. That was the truth that twisted in her chest day after day. She did not regret it, and yet she could not stop grieving what she had given up. In her quieter moments, she would think about her mother's face, about Seraphina calling her name in the pre-dawn darkness before the hunts, about the weight of the Pride's eyes on her as she learned to move with authority and grace. She would think about what Scar must be doing in Pride Rock, unchallenged now, free to reshape everything in his image, to poison the very ground with his rule. And she would wonder, in the voice of the girl she was supposed to be, whether her absence had made it easier, whether her flight had guaranteed the very corruption she was trying to escape. Simba did not carry this weight, or if he did, he had learned to set it down with the same ease that he picked up a beetle and ate it, his old self dissolving like morning mist. And Nala loved him for his peace, even as it terrified her, because she was beginning to understand that his peace and her anguish were the same thing viewed from different angles. They were both of them forgetting. She was forgetting who she was supposed to be, and he was forgetting who he had been, and the jungle was teaching them both, in its patient way, that perhaps those were the only ways to survive. A year in the jungle is enough time for certain truths to become invisible, and I think that is perhaps the saddest thing about exile. Not that it removes you from home, but that it allows you to forget why home mattered in the first place. Simba, by this point, has grown, not just in size, though he has. The cub has become a young lion, his mane beginning to fill in, his shoulders broadening, but in his capacity to not think. Timon and Pumbaa have become, in a real and genuine way, his family, and the jungle itself has become his entire world, complete and sufficient unto itself. The abundance here is almost obscene when you consider what is happening at that very moment in the place he was born. There are insects in impossible profusion, fruit hanging from every canopy, water that does not require you to dig for it or fight for it or watch it drain away into sand. The jungle does not ask him anything about himself, and he has learned to love it for that mercy. I find myself thinking about this a lot, the way that avoidance can feel, for a time, like peace. When Timon catches his eye across the watering hole and begins to do something ridiculous, some performance, some bit of misdirection that Simba has learned to find genuinely funny, the young lion laughs, and in that moment the laugh is real. There is no performance in it. The past is not gone, but it has become so distant, so deliberately unexamined, that it has the quality of something that happened to someone else. Hakuna Matata, Timon had taught him in those first weeks, means no worries for the rest of your days. It is a problem-free philosophy, Timon had said, and Simba had believed him, because in the jungle, with his belly full and his friends beside him, it seemed entirely possible that philosophy could simply erase the weight of a dead father and a murdered kingdom. What Timon and Pumbaa do not understand, cannot understand, for they have never been taught to understand it, is that there are some weights that cannot be erased, only temporarily ignored. Nala, by contrast, is slowly drowning. She is not starving. The jungle provides for her as it provides for Simba, and a hunter's skill means she eats better than she has any right to expect. But hunger is not the only kind of emptiness, and she has discovered, over this year, that abundance without purpose is its own particular form of starvation. Every night when Simba sleeps, when he lies in the crook of a massive root, his breathing easy and his face peaceful in a way she remembers his father's face never was, Nala finds herself unable to close her eyes. She lies in the dark and thinks about her mother, Seraphina, who remained in the Pride Lands. She thinks about the lionesses she grew up with, the ones she was supposed to lead. She thinks about Scar, not the uncle she once knew, but the creature he has become, the one who wears the throne like a parasite wears skin. Most of all, she thinks about the moment she made her choice, standing at the edge of Pride Rock, feeling the pull of duty on one side and love on the other, and choosing love. There are nights when she believes that was the right choice, when she holds that belief like a smooth stone and tries not to drop it. There are other nights, and there have been more of these as the months have passed, when she lies awake and wonders if she committed treason against her own people. The circle of life, which Mufasa taught Simba about before he died, and which Nala learned, as all lions learn, in the rhythms of the Pride Lands, is not abstract philosophy to her, it is lived truth. The pride hunts so that the herds remain strong. The lions eat so that the lions survive. Everything has its place, everything has its weight and consequence. The jungle does not know the circle of life. It is too abundant to need it, too full of unconsidered surplus to understand that every action ripples outward. And Simba has learned to live here so completely, so happily, that Nala sometimes looks at him and barely recognizes the cub she followed into exile. There is a night, perhaps not this exact night, but representative of the many nights like it, when Simba sits beside her under the stars, and she watches his face and sees that he is not haunted by anything. He is simply present, simply happy, simply alive in a way that she has come to understand means he has chosen not to be a prince anymore. She can feel the weight of what she has not chosen, the burden of memory, the responsibility she carried in her bones before she even knew she carried it. I think of duty as a kind of inheritance, the way some families inherit eyes or a particular set to the shoulders. Nala was born to it, the way Simba was, but where he has managed to set it down, or perhaps bury it so deep that it no longer speaks to him, she has not found a way to do that. When she tries, it does not stick. When she tries to believe in Hakuna Matata, in the philosophy of no worries and no past and no tomorrow, Something in her resists it with a kind of primal revulsion. It is as if her very bones refuse the idea, as if her mother's voice is still somewhere in her bloodline, insisting that there are things that matter, things worth carrying, things worth suffering for. 1 year in the jungle, and Simba has become someone who can wake each morning and genuinely not think about the Pride Lands. 1 year in the jungle, and Nala has become someone who cannot stop thinking about them. They are together, these two, in a place of plenty, and they have never been further apart. She loves him. She thinks about this too, in the dark hours. But she is beginning to understand that love is not always enough to hold two people together when they are walking in opposite directions. He is walking toward forgetting, and she is walking deeper into remembrance, and the jungle stretches around them, green and abundant and indifferent to the fact that back home, the world is dying. In the early days of Scar's reign, when the dust from the stampede had barely settled and the pride was still raw with grief, there was a moment when everything might have gone differently, a moment that hinged entirely on a single absence. Nala was not there to say the truth. Nala, who had been born into the knowledge of succession, who carried in her bones the understanding of what the circle of life demanded, was gone, searching for Simba in the desert, while Scar stood before the assembled pride and rewrote their story. I find myself thinking about that timing a lot, because power, I've come to understand, is not a thing you seize all at once. It's a thing you fill into the spaces left behind by the people who should have resisted. Scar's name, his real name, the one hardly anyone remembered by now, was Tarkar, and Tarkar had always been the brother who looked on from the margins, the one with the scar that split his face like a punishment, earned, depending on which version of the story you believed, in a moment of jealous miscalculation involving a buffalo. He had spent his whole life watching Mufasa be the king, and now the king was dead, and the heir was dead, and the only lioness who might have questioned the narrative was gone into the night after a boy she somehow knew was alive. Scar stood at Pride Rock and told the pride. Both of them perished in the gorge. The stampede took them both. There was no one to contradict him. What he didn't say, what he knew the pride wouldn't ask him to explain, was why a young lion destined to inherit the throne would have been in the gorge at all, or why Simba would have run from his father instead of toward him. But grief makes people credulous, and fear makes them compliant, and Scar had learned long ago how to read the exact moment when a crowd would accept a story rather than demand the truth of it. The transformation that followed was not gradual. It was almost immediate, which is perhaps the thing that frightens me most when I sit with this part of the story. Power, when it is rooted in a lie and protected by fear, does not build slowly, it calcifies. Within the first weeks, Scar had done something that should not have been possible. He had invited the hyena clan back into the Pride Lands. The hyena clan, Shenzi, Banzai, Ed, and the vast, vast numbers of their kin, the kind of numbers that should have alarmed every lioness who looked at them, had been banished from these lands by Mufasa himself, exiled to the elephant graveyard, locked out of the circle of life that sustained the Pride Lands. Mufasa had kept them as a separate thing, a violent thing, not quite natural to the savannah. Scar changed that in a single declaration. He stood at Pride Rock and told the hyenas they would never go hungry again, and in that promise, in the lifting of Mufasa's ancient boundary, he gave them permission to enter the lands as enforcers, as witnesses to his rule, as the muscles that would keep the lionesses compliant. They came in numbers that should have terrified the pride, but fear, I've learned, can feel indistinguishable from protection when you're grieving. The lionesses did not resist, because resistance would have required the kind of unified strength that only a future queen could have organized, and Nala was not there to organize it. Without Nala, there was Sarabi, Mufasa's widow, the queen mother who remained at Pride Rock and watched her world rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. Sarabi, to her great and tragic credit, did not accept this quietly. She defied Scar openly, called him less than half the king her husband had been, spoke the truth to his face even as the hyenas circled closer, even as his eyes took on that peculiar brightness that meant he was no longer quite anchored to what was real. One day, when she had insulted him once too directly, when she had refused to accept his version of events, Scar struck her. A blow delivered in front of the pride, in front of the hyenas, in front of everyone who might have harbored even the smallest thought of resistance. That single strike was the full answer to any question about what his reign would be. Not persuasion, power. Not collaboration, submission. The territory itself began to change almost immediately, as though the land itself was responding to the departure of both heirs and the arrival of an illegitimate king. The hyenas hunted with an efficiency that should have seemed like blessing, but which, I understand now, was catastrophe. They took more than was needed, depleted prey populations that had sustained themselves through generations of the circle of life's careful balance, hunted as though tomorrow would never come, as though the land was infinite. Scar did nothing to stop them, or could not stop them, or did not want to. The savannas that had been green began to turn to dust, and Scar, sitting on his throne at Pride Rock with hyena sentinels at his shoulders, refused to move the pride, refused to migrate to hunting grounds that still had prey, refused to acknowledge that his grip on the territory, his precious, absolute hold on the thing Mufasa had given to Simba, was destroying everything it touched. The watering hole, that sacred center of life, began to run dry. The carcasses of fallen prey and fallen predators began to litter the landscape like accusation. And Scar on his throne began to show the first signs of the fracture that would later consume him entirely. He spoke sometimes, as though Mufasa was still present, as though the dead king's ghost was perched somewhere above his shoulder, watching, judging, refusing to acknowledge his ascension. He ordered the pride never to speak Mufasa's name aloud, as though language itself could erase the memory of the king who had ruled before him, could somehow revise the entire history of the lands into one where Scar had always been the natural inheritor. One of the things that strikes me, sitting with this part of the chronicle, is how completely Scar's power depended on the absence of people who should have been there. Simba would have challenged him, eventually, would have had to, the moment he understood the truth of the stampede. But Simba was gone, learning to forget his own name in a paradise of abundance. Nala would have organized resistance, would have given the lionesses a focal point around which to cohere, would have made the defiance that Sarabi attempted into something organized and terrible and impossible to contain. But Nala was gone too, separated from home by distance and by her own choice, unaware that her flight had left a vacuum that Scar was filling with hyenas and lies, and the slow strangulation of the circle of life itself. The lionesses continued to hunt. They had no choice. But the game became scarcer as the hyenas overhunted, and the pride began to experience the first whispers of the hunger that would later consume them. In the jungle, Simba was learning not to be king, learning not to be Simba at all. At Pride Rock, Scar was learning to be king in a way that had nothing to do with the circle of life, and everything to do with fear and hyenas, and a lie that nobody alive could contradict. The Pride lands transformed around them, not suddenly, but with the absolute inevitability of a kingdom dying, and neither of them was there to stop it. In the middle years of Scar's reign, perhaps 3 years after that terrible night in the gorge, the Pride lands had become something that barely resembled itself, a kingdom reduced to its most skeletal elements. What was once a web of cooperation and shared hunting had frayed into something closer to a system of extraction and control, the hyenas taking what little remained and Scar watching from his throne as it all ran down. I think about Sarabi in those middle years quite often, because she is the one who had to stay and witness what the absence of both her king and her heir had made possible. Mufasa was gone, struck down in a stampede, the story went, though Sarabi had her doubts about the details, the way Scar told it always just slightly wrong. And Simba was dead too, they said, trampled in the same rush of wildebeest, and so the young heir's potential was sealed away forever. What remained was Scar, who had always been lean and clever, but now seemed to grow harder the longer he held the crown, as though power was something that calcified him rather than nourished him. The hyenas, Shenzi and Banzai and Ed, had been invited into the Pride Lands with promises of abundance, of a kingdom where they would never go hungry again, a promise that made sense when it was made, but became monstrous almost immediately. Because hyenas hunt differently than lions, they do not manage populations the way the circle of life requires. They do not leave enough for tomorrow because they are taught by their own hunger that there may be no tomorrow at all. The herds that should have migrated through every season, the game that should have sustained the pride and the predators, began to thin, and then to disappear entirely, hunted beyond any possibility of recovery. The watering hole, the heart of the Pride Lands, the place where all life gathered and was sustained, began to shrink. The rivers that should have flowed constant, with the rains, ran dry. The earth cracked and paled like bone left in the sun, and Scar, from his throne at Pride Rock, did nothing. Or rather, he did something worse than nothing. He forbade the pride from leaving. Other prides, other families, they moved when drought came. They migrated, they traveled to where the land still held water and life, and they survived by understanding that loyalty to a place had to bend sometimes to the demands of living. But Scar would not move, because his hold on power was territorial, and to move would be to admit that his rule had failed, and that was something he could not bear. So the pride stayed, and they starved. Sarabi led the lionesses on hunts. It was still her role, still what she did, because the work did not stop even when the work had become nearly impossible. She would organize the coalition, the hunters who worked together, and they would range farther and farther from Pride Rock, looking for game that was no longer there, searching riverbed after riverbed that had run dry. She was a dignified creature, and she did not complain in a way that would reach the ears of the other lionesses, because a leader's fear is contagious, and the pride was already afraid. But there was something in her bearing, I think, a kind of weight that accumulated through that middle period, a knowledge that she was managing the slow death of her own family. And then came the moment. There are always these moments, aren't there, when someone finally speaks aloud what everyone has been thinking in silence, when Sarabi stood before Scar and asked him why there was no food. Not asked in a humble way. She did not plead or beg, because Sarabi was born a queen, and she did not forget that even when the king tried to make her forget. She asked him directly, comparing his failure to the way Mufasa had ruled, and in that comparison she made a claim that Scar could not allow to stand. That the old king had been better, that the old king had understood something Scar did not, that the old king had been worthy of the crown in a way that Scar was not. And Scar struck her. I want to be very clear about what that was. It was not a private moment, not a matter between him and her to be handled away from the pride. It happened before them all, in the place where they gathered, so that every lioness watching understood that this is what defiance would cost them. It was theatre of cruelty, and it worked. After that, the pride learned to ask questions only in whispers, if at all. What had happened, I think, in those years is that the absence of Nala had created a specific kind of vacuum that Scar had moved into and made his own. Because Nala was not just the future queen, not just a title. She was a possibility, a focal point around which resistance might gather, a lioness whose bond with Simba represented continuity and the circle of life continuing onward. Without her, there was nothing to point toward except Scar, and Scar was the only power structure present. The lionesses could not challenge the hyenas directly. They were outnumbered and outmatched, and hyena teeth are vicious things in a way that lion's strength could not always overcome. They could not leave because the hyenas watched the borders, and a single lioness trying to cross alone was a thing that would be torn to pieces before she made it halfway. They could not appeal to Scar, because Scar had made clear that he had no interest in their survival, except insofar as they served him. So they stayed, and they grew thinner, and they watched the young cubs, fewer and fewer of them each cycle, because the pride simply could not sustain pregnancy and nursing when there was barely enough meat to keep the hunters alive. And they waited for something to change in a way that no one really believed would happen. The hyenas themselves were beginning to suffer, though not in any way that made them less dangerous. Hunger made them only more vicious, more desperate, more willing to fight even among themselves for the scraps that remained. Even Shenzi, who had negotiated the original arrangement with Scar, was beginning to understand that she had made a bargain with a king who was failing, who could not keep the promise of abundance because the abundance had all been devoured already. But Scar still held them to their bargain, still demanded their loyalty, still threatened them with the same tools he used against the pride. Violence, deprivation, the constant reminder that defiance would cost you everything. And so the system held together, barely, through sheer coercion and fear, which is always the weakest kind of holding together, the kind that requires constant energy to maintain, the kind that is always on the brink of shattering. The kingdom was dying, and everyone could see it, and no one knew how to stop it. Sarabi carried that knowledge in her bearing, in the way she moved, in the dignity she refused to let go of, even as the pride lands turned to dust around her. And somewhere in the jungle, separated from home by distance and by choice, Nala felt something of this, a pull, a weight, a knowledge that something was terribly wrong that she could not quite articulate and could not quite ignore. There is a small red-billed hornbill named Zazu who, before all of this began, lived a life of extraordinary clarity. He knew his role, he knew his king, and he knew precisely what was expected of him each dawn. Zazu had been Mufasa's majordomo for years, not merely a servant, but a confidant, a keeper of the kingdom's schedules and secrets, the bird who slept at the edge of the royal chamber knowing that if Mufasa needed counsel in the night, Zazu would be there. He had tutored young Simba in deportment and duty, had tried desperately to keep the curious cub from wandering into danger, and when Mufasa asked him to watch the air that day in the gorge, Zazu had accepted the weight of it without hesitation, as he accepted all things. But Scar had seen to it that Zazu would not interfere during the stampede. A blow to the head, a moment of unconsciousness, and the majordomo woke to find the world transformed. Mufasa was gone, supposedly taking Simba with him, and Scar sat upon the throne as though it had always been his to claim. And here is the thing about Zazu that I find myself returning to again and again. He was kept as a prisoner, yes, caged in a skull at Pride Rock for Scar's amusement, but his imprisonment was not without purpose. Scar knew that Zazu was dangerous, not because he was a warrior, but because he carried memory, loyalty, and the machinery of the kingdom's true operation in his small, clear mind. To cage the majordomo was to sever the connection between the old reign and any resistance that might grow in the new. So Zazu sang in his skull cage the songs Scar demanded, mournful things, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Never the bright songs he had once sung for Mufasa, never It's a Small World or anything that might make even Scar smile. For Scar's cruelty extended even to denying himself the comfort of joy, as though happiness itself were a betrayal of his bitter nature. And yet, in that cage, Zazu began to do something that was perhaps both his greatest act of loyalty and his most dangerous transgression. He began, quietly and with meticulous care, to listen. The hyenas came and went, boasting to each other about hunts, about the dried riverbeds, about sightings and rumors, and the state of the land beyond Pride Rock. Shenzi, the clever one, the leader, spoke with Scar in tones of provisional alliance, and Zazu, listening from his cage, began to understand that Scar's rule was not a partnership, but a negotiation held together by shared hunger and fear. The other two hyenas, Banzai and Ed, were cruder instruments, but even they yielded information. The locations of water holes that still held moisture, the territories they had claimed as hunting grounds, the paths they patrolled. And as the weeks became months and the months became years, Zazu began to do something that would have been unthinkable before. He began to ask questions. Cleverly, never directly, never in a way that would alert Scar to any purpose beyond the natural curiosity of a caged bird. He would hum differently when the hyenas passed, as though his mood shifted with the time of day, and they would respond. Boastful, contemptuous creatures, without realizing they were feeding information to a vast, patient intelligence. More remarkably, Zazu began to move beyond Pride Rock. Scar, confident in his paranoia, sometimes sent the Majordomo on errands, to speak to Sarabi with messages of demand, to carry news to distant parts of the kingdom, to serve as a visible reminder of Scar's authority to lionesses and lesser creatures across the land. And here is where Zazu's true nature asserted itself, the part of him that had served a just king and would not rest while a murderer occupied the throne. He began, during these errands, to plant seeds. He would speak to the lionesses not of resistance, that would have been reckless, and Zazu was never reckless, but of memory. Do you remember how Mufasa spoke of the circle of life? Do you remember the way the herds used to cross without fear? Do you remember the taste of water before the drought? He spoke not as an agitator, but as a keeper of the old way, a small voice saying, "This was not always so, and it need not remain this way forever." And he gathered, slowly and with extraordinary care, the fragments of news that might tell him something crucial, the news that mattered most, the news he had begun to search for in earnest. Was Simba alive? For Zazu had seen Simba that day in the gorge, had watched the cub run toward his father, and then watched the stampede wash everything away. And in the chaos and his own unconsciousness, he could not be certain what he had witnessed. Scar claimed the heir was dead, and officially that was the law of the Pride Lands now. To suggest otherwise was treason. But Zazu, in his cage, and in the careful movements of his clandestine errands, began to ask the question in the only ways he could. Did anyone see the body? Did anyone truly see him fall? There was a shaman, an old mandrill named Rafiki, who lived in the vast baobab tree away from Pride Rock and spoke in riddles, communing with the spirits and the wind. And Zazu, who had once lived in a world of certainty, began to believe in subtle signs. He noticed when Rafiki would appear at the borders of the Pride Lands, watching, always watching, as though the old shaman too was searching for something the world had told him was lost. Zazu could not directly approach him. Such a meeting would be madness, too visible. But he began to leave signs, small patterns in the dust, brief calls that echoed across the savannas, the language of a palace servant who had learned, in captivity, to speak in code. And he listened for responses. The truth is that Zazu's situation was impossible, in a way that I think deserves to sit with us for a moment. He was a prisoner who served the man who imprisoned him. He appeared each day to do Scar's bidding, to carry his messages, to sing his mournful songs, to be the visible reminder of conquered order. And at the same time, he was a spy, not for any kingdom or faction, but for an idea, that Mufasa had been just, that the old way had been true, that the current regime was built on lies. He could not rebel openly. The hyenas would destroy him, and he was too old and too small to be of any use in combat. But he could remember. He could listen. He could plant questions in the minds of the lionesses who still lived under Scar's rule, could leave whispers for Rafiki to find, could create the scaffolding of resistance in a kingdom where resistance seemed impossible. And here is what troubles me most about this strange season of Zazu's life. He was doing all of this while Simba slept in the jungle, unaware that anyone was searching for him. Nala was somewhere out there, walking the borderlands between the dying kingdom and exile, tormented by memory and duty. And Zazu, caged at Pride Rock, was the only one actively, methodically, with meticulous care, maintaining the thread that might one day call them home. He did not know if Simba was alive. He did not know if the search would ever be found. But he continued anyway, day after day, singing sad songs and listening to hyenas and speaking gently to lionesses, because that was what loyalty meant when everything else had been stripped away. It meant refusing to let the story end the way Scar had written it. It meant insisting, quietly, that things could still be otherwise. 3 years is long enough to know what you have lost, but not long enough to stop feeling its weight. And it was in Nala's 3rd year in the jungle that the weight finally became unbearable. She had watched Simba learn to forget, truly forget, not the surface forgetting of distraction, but the deeper forgetting of someone who had chosen to become a different person. And she had tried, with everything she had, to do the same. But forgetting, she discovered, was not something you could will into existence the way you could will yourself to stay quiet or to smile when smiling felt like a betrayal. It came or it did not come, and for her it did not come. Her mother's face had not faded from her mind in 3 years. If anything, it had sharpened, the lines of her mother's jaw more vivid in memory than they were in life, her voice, even the small inflections, the slight rasp when she was tired from hunting, preserved with an exactness that felt almost like cruelty. Seraphina would be older now, more tired, and Nala could not stop imagining the particular way her mother might be tired. There was also the matter of the lionesses she had been born to lead, the ones she had left behind without warning, without explanation, without even the mercy of knowing whether she was alive or dead. 3 years is also long enough to understand that your absence has consequences. She began, around the middle of her 3rd year, to wake before Simba, to move to the edge of their territory alone and sit in the darkness before dawn, listening to the jungle's slow breathing and feeling something in her chest that she did not have a name for, something that sat between guilt and necessity, between the life she had chosen and the life that had been chosen for her. One night, she made a decision that she did not tell him about, and I think that is perhaps the most important detail in all of what comes next, the first real secret between them. She would go back. Not to stay, not to reclaim her place. She could not even imagine that anymore, could not imagine walking into Pride Rock and pretending that 3 years of absence had not severed something essential between her and the lionesses who had been waiting. But to look, to see with her own eyes what had become of the kingdom while she sheltered in paradise. To know, in the way that imagination could never make her know, what her choice to leave had wrought. And perhaps, though she barely let herself think this, to find some small way to help, some small way to make the scale less unbalanced, even if only for a moment. The journey was dangerous in ways that Simba, who had spent 3 years learning to forget that danger existed, could not have understood anymore. The jungle's edge was not a wall. It was a gradual thinning, a slow transition from abundance to scarcity, and as Nala walked it alone, she felt the abundance falling away behind her like a veil being drawn back. The watering holes became smaller, more sparse, and by the time she reached the boundary territories, the lands that were no longer quite jungle but not yet savanna, they were nearly dry. The herds had gone, as she somehow knew they would have. There was nothing here now but dust and the faint, sour smell of a place where something had died and not been properly consumed, had simply lain down in the sun and begun to corrupt. She moved only at night, knowing from Zazu's long-ago lessons that this was how you traveled when you did not want to be seen, and the moon, which had seemed so beautiful in the jungle, so safe and distant, became a danger here, bright enough to cast a shadow as dark and visible as a body. 3 years into Scar's reign, the Pride Lands had begun to smell like a place where the circle of life had broken. It was not a scent she remembered, and that was perhaps the worst part of it. She had expected to come home to something recognizable, even if it was damaged, even if it was dying. But what she found was something that had become fundamentally unrecognizable. The grass, what remained of it, was not gold but a kind of ash-grey, not growing so much as stubbornly existing, and the dust that coated everything, that worked its way into her fur and her mouth, had a particular quality of emptiness to it, as though the earth itself had been hollowed out from below. She made her way toward the water hole first, moving through territory she had hunted since childhood, and found it nearly dry, a vast ring of cracked mud with only a trickle of water at the center, dark with something she did not want to identify. Around it, in the dust, were the remains of countless small deaths. Birds that had come seeking water and collapsed, small mammals that had dug down and found nothing, the scattered bones of creatures that had simply given up. There was a sense of surrender in those bones, and she understood, looking at them, that this was not a place where predators and prey still moved in the old rhythm, was not a place where the circle of life still turned. It was a place where life had simply ceased to circle and had instead begun to drain away, like water through a hole in stone. She did not dare approach Pride Rock directly. The hyenas would be there, hundreds of them patrolling in packs, and a lone lioness, no matter how skilled, could not take them. But she found a vantage point in the rocks above the main Pride lands, where the light did not quite reach, and she looked down on her home. Pride Rock itself seemed to have darkened, seemed to have somehow absorbed all the dust and despair of the kingdom it ruled, and even from a distance she could see that the bones scattered at its base, a thing that had been almost ceremonial under Mufasa, a kind of sculptural arrangement of the cycle of life, had accumulated into something that looked almost like a throne. There were too many of them, and they had not been arranged with care. They simply lay where they had fallen, a monument to waste and excess, and she understood, looking at them, that Scar did not believe in the circle of life at all, or believed in it the way a consumer believes in a supply line, something that exists only to be used, to be emptied, to be discarded once it had been thoroughly exhausted. She saw, on the second night of her watching, a lioness who might have been Sarabi, though the distance made it hard to be certain. The lioness moved with difficulty, as though her bones ached, and she was followed closely by two hyenas who seemed to regard her with a mixture of fear and contempt. That image, the lioness moving with that particular weariness, those hyenas at her heels, was the image that stayed with Nala, that would stay with her, and she realized in that moment that her mother was still alive, was still in Pride Rock, was still somehow managing to be a lioness in a place that had become fundamentally hostile to the concept of lionesses. On her third night, she heard Zazu. It was a small sound, almost musical, a kind of coded bird song that she almost did not recognize because it did not belong to the normal patterns of the jungle she had learned to hear, and she followed it without thinking, moving down from her vantage point and toward a place where the rocks were narrowest and the shadows were deepest. There, perched on a fragment of stone that had separated from Pride Rock in some ancient landslide, was the old majordomo, looking exactly as he had looked 3 years ago, and yet somehow transformed, aged not in appearance, but in the way he held his small frame, as though he was carrying something tremendously heavy. He had been waiting for her, she realized, not knowing she was coming but leaving the song there anyway, a kind of beacon for whoever might hear it, and when their eyes met across the darkness, she saw that he recognized her, and that recognition contained within it the knowledge that he had been searching for exactly this, some proof that the heir was alive, or that the future queen had not been entirely consumed by her choice to abandon her throne. There is something in that moment I keep returning to, the moment when the hunted and the hunter finally see each other across the wreckage of their shared kingdom, and in seeing each other, acknowledge that resistance is still possible, that forgetting is not the only option, that the story is not yet finished, even though everyone had agreed to read it that way. 3 years had passed since Nala left the jungle at night, moving in secret through the territories she and Simba had crossed together when they first found their way to paradise. But this time she moved in the opposite direction, toward the place she had tried so hard to forget. The borderlands were the first shock. The grasslands she remembered as golden and alive were thin, brittle, almost translucent in the late afternoon light, as though the earth itself had lost the will to grow. She found the old watering hole first, or rather she found the scar where it had been, a depression in the ground that held nothing but white stone and the smell of minerals left behind when water had forgotten to come back. There was a way the land looked when it was dying, not the quick death of fire or flood, but the slow, quiet death of abandonment, as though the savannah itself was learning to let go. She moved carefully now, keeping to the high ground where the scrub was thin enough to see approaching movement, because the hyenas would still be hunting, and Scar's reach would extend to the very edges of what remained. It took her until dusk to reach the ridge overlooking Pride Rock, and when she did, she sat very still for a long time, not quite believing what she was seeing. The rock itself looked smaller somehow, or perhaps she had grown larger in her memory, the way childhood homes do when you return to them as an adult. But the way it looked was unmistakably diminished, harder, less alive. The grass around it was gone entirely, burned away or eaten to nothing, and the paths that had connected the Pride's territory to the greater lands were marked now only by bones, not scattered, but arranged, as though someone had wanted them to be seen. She could see movement at the base of the rock, the flash of hyena fur, and the easy, violent posture of creatures who had been given dominion without wisdom. And she understood in that moment what Zazu had tried to tell her months ago when they had met at the abandoned watering hole. Her absence had created a space, and Scar had filled it so completely that there was almost nothing left to reclaim. From her vantage point, she could make out the entrance to the cave where she had watched the lionesses gather under Mufasa's reign, where there had been order and something that resembled hope, and now there was only stillness and the occasional movement of guards. She waited until the light had almost gone, and then moved down the ridge, staying in the deepest shadows, moving the way Timon had taught Simba to move, low and quiet, using the landscape to disappear into itself. As she drew closer to the rock, she heard voices. Shenzi's harsh laugh, unmistakable even across the years, and behind it the deeper rumble of Banzai, and beneath it all the soft, scattered giggle of Ed, the hyena who never seemed quite to understand the violence he was participating in. There was also another voice, lower and colder, one that made her entire body go still. Scar's voice, giving orders, and in the tone of it she heard the absolute certainty of someone who believed he had already won everything and need only maintain it. She moved closer still, until she could see into the cave itself, and there, lying on the stone where Mufasa had lain on the night Nala's entire life had changed, was Sarabi, her mother's friend and the queen she had been born to serve. And even from a distance, even in the dying light, Nala could see that Sarabi was hollowed out, diminished, barely a shadow of the fierce lioness she had been. Nala found herself breathing in small, careful movements, as though any larger breath might draw attention, might give away her position. But it was also as though she was trying not to let the full weight of what she was seeing into her chest all at once. She had known, intellectually, that her absence had consequences. She had carried that knowledge in the dark hours of the jungle like a stone she could not set down. But knowing and seeing were different things, and the sight of Sarabi's diminishment, of the bone-scattered wastelands that had been her home, of Scar's absolute and uncontested dominion over everything she had been meant to lead, that was knowledge of a different kind entirely. For a moment, she found herself thinking of Simba, sleeping peacefully in the jungle with Timon and Pumbaa, unburdened by the knowledge of what his absence had wrought, and she was not sure if what she felt was envy or contempt or simply a kind of desperate, hollow grief. As she watched, Scar moved into the full light, and she could see him clearly now. He had aged in the years of her exile, but not with strength. He had aged the way tyrants do, becoming harder and more vicious precisely because the power he had seized was so absolute that he had begun to believe in his own right to it. The scar on his face seemed darker somehow, or perhaps it was just the light, and his movements had the careful precision of something that had learned to conserve energy while maintaining threat. A snake coiled and patient, and utterly certain that nothing could move without his permission. Shenzi approached him with something in her mouth, a carcass, nearly picked clean, and Scar took it without acknowledgement, ate without gratitude, and Nala realized in that moment something that shifted the entire weight of her understanding. The hyenas were not truly his allies, they were his servants, kept in line by the same violence and contempt that bound the lionesses. Scar had not created a kingdom. He had created a system of predation so complete that it was eating itself, starting at the edges and working inward, and the only thing holding it together was the belief that it was too strong to resist. As the sun finally touched the horizon, Nala backed away, moving the same way she had come, until she was clear of the rock and moving back up the ridge toward the borderlands. She did not stop moving until she was well into the scrub country, until she could no longer see Pride Rock even when she turned back to look, and then she sat down in the gathering dark and tried to think clearly about what she needed to do. The knowledge of what her absence had cost was now a weight inside her that could not be set down, but it was not the weight of simple guilt. It was something more complex, more terrible. The weight of knowing that she could go back to Simba tomorrow, could tell him what she had seen, and he might still choose not to care. She could lead a rebellion. She understood that now, understood that Zazu had been waiting for her, understood that the lionesses were ready, that there was a structure of resistance that had grown like roots through the years of her absence, waiting for her to return and nurture it into something that could break the surface. But she could also go back to the jungle, could lie beside Simba under the stars, could choose the peace and the forgetting that she had been running from for 3 years, and no one would blame her. The circle of life taught that all things were connected, that every death and every birth was part of a pattern that held meaning, that matter was not destroyed but transformed, and that if you paid attention, you could hear the voice of it in the wind and the rain. Hakuna Matata taught that there were no obligations, that the past was a thing you could leave behind like old skin, that meaning itself was a burden that only the foolish chose to carry. She sat in the dark for a long time, caught between 2 philosophies, 2 ways of being, and understood finally that she could not return to Simba without making a choice that would separate them forever. And so Nala, standing in the rubble of her kingdom with the weight of 3 years' absence behind her, made a choice that was neither flight nor full return. She chose to stay, and to work in the dark places where Scar could not see her. The discovery of Zazu alive, caged but thinking, suffering but still loyal, was the moment she understood that resistance had never truly died, only hidden itself in the small spaces between Scar's patrols and his certainty. What passed between them across the broken landscape was not quite a conversation. It was recognition, the way 2 creatures might understand each other after years of separation, the knowledge that they both remembered a world that no longer existed. Zazu told her of Sarabi's quiet defiance, the way the Queen had refused Scar's advances and would not legitimize his rule with submission, even as her body weakened from hunger and her spirit frayed under constant watch. He spoke of the lionesses, some still loyal, all of them afraid, who whispered Mufasa's name in places where the hyenas could not hear, keeping alive a memory that Scar had tried to forbid into non-existence. And he told her of the rifts appearing in Scar's grip. The hyenas, he said, were beginning to starve as the land died, and a starving predator made for uncertain allies, no matter how much fear held them together. Nala listened, and as she listened, she felt something shift inside her. The burden of forgetting lifted just slightly, replaced not with hope exactly, but with purpose. She could not go back to the jungle and tell Simba that the kingdom he had abandoned was still alive in pieces, still worth saving, because she already knew what Simba would do with that knowledge. He would bury it beneath Hakuna Matata, as he had buried everything else. So instead, she made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life, though she did not yet know it. She chose to stay. The first weeks were about careful observation, about learning the rhythms of Scar's paranoia and the hyena patrols, about mapping the invisible routes through the Pride Lands, where a lioness could move without being seen. Nala began to slip back into Pride Rock in the hour before dawn, when the night shift of hyenas grew drowsy and Scar himself lay sleeping, secure in his unchallenged power. She moved like something barely there, a shadow among shadows, and the lionesses she found in those stolen moments, hunting in the failing light, resting in the caves where Scar's eyes could not reach them, recognized in her something they thought they had lost. What Nala brought back to them was not a rescue, it was permission. Permission to remember that they had been something other than victims, that their strength had not vanished simply because Scar had seized the throne, that the code they had learned from Mufasa still lived in their bones if they could find the courage to recall it. Sarabi was the keystone, and this Nala understood from the beginning with a clarity that surprised her, for her mother Serafina had taught her to see people, truly see them, and she saw in Simba's mother a lion who was choosing resistance the only way she could, through refusal. When Nala found her in the inner chambers at Pride Rock, guarded but not quite imprisoned, the queen looked at the young lioness as though she were seeing a ghost, or perhaps a solution to an impossible question. They could not speak freely, the risk was too great, but in the glances they exchanged lay an entire conversation. Sarabi had never stopped believing that the circle of life demanded more than submission, and she was waiting, though she did not know for what, for whom, or how long she would have to wait. Together, they began to move with extraordinary subtlety, recruiting lionesses one at a time, meeting in caves and thickets where the hyena patrols rarely ventured, teaching them the old hunting patterns that Mufasa had used, the coordinated movements that turned individual strength into collective power. Zazu became their liaison, his imprisonment paradoxically a shield. Scar, secure in his dominance, barely noticed the old bird's carefully coded songs anymore, did not recognize that each mournful refrain was actually a message, a map, a signal sent to the lionesses about patrol timings and Scar's whereabouts. Nala taught the lionesses to read his moods the way he had taught her to understand the circle of life, to see in Scar's mounting paranoia and his cruel treatment of the hyenas the seeds of his own undoing. There was a particular brilliance in the way the kingdom was being set up for collapse from within. Scar relied entirely on the hyenas, yet he trusted them not at all, alternately flattering them and abusing them, promising them rewards he could not deliver as the land died around them. The hyenas were beginning to starve, and a starving predator was a creature that might be turned against its master if given sufficient reason. What Nala did not do, and this is important to understand, is prepare for open rebellion. Not yet, not while Scar's control remained so absolute and the hyena enforcers so numerous and so desperate. Instead, she worked in the spaces between certainty, the margins where Scar's paranoia had not yet reached, gathering information, strengthening the lionesses, keeping alive the possibility that resistance could take form if the moment ever came when it might actually succeed. Months passed in this hidden work, and Nala found herself living two lives again. One in the jungle with Simba, who still believed they could simply remain where they were, that the world beyond the river had ceased to matter, and one in the shadows of Pride Rock, moving between meetings with Sarabi, coded conversations with Zazu, and the careful recruitment of lionesses who were hungry not just for food, but for the memory of honor. The pain of this divided existence was something she learned to carry in silence, the same way Sarabi carried it, the same way the queen had carried the weight of being violated by a lion who wore her husband's throne and spoke with his authority, but carried none of his wisdom. There is a loneliness in being the only one who knows the true shape of things, in seeing the corruption and the suffering and the waste while the rest of the world sleeps, either willfully or in exhaustion. Nala came to understand that this was what it meant to be a queen in waiting, not to reign, but to hold the kingdom together through your own willingness to break, to see the cruelty and not look away, to remember what was worth saving even when saving it seemed impossible. And in the deep places of her heart, she carried a grief she could not name. The knowledge that Simba would never choose this, would never understand why she could not simply remain in the jungle with him, forgetting the crown and the duty and the lionesses who depended on what she had been born to become. The revolution that would come did not begin with banners or roars. It began with Nala's choice to stay in the dark, with Sarabi's refusal to break, with Zazu's patient coding of songs, and with the slow, careful gathering of strength among lionesses who had learned that even in a dying kingdom, hope could take the shape of quiet, coordinated action in the spaces where the tyrant could not see. 4 years after Simba fled into the desert, there is a night in the jungle where he lies under the stars with Nala beside him, and they are entirely at peace, the kind of peace that only comes from having stopped asking certain questions. In the earliest days, Hakuna Matata had been a boy, a philosophy offered to a drowning boy, a way to float when sinking seemed like the only thing his body knew how to do. But by the 4th year, something has shifted in Simba that is harder to name than survival, and gentler than forgetting. It has become, against all intention, a kind of genuine happiness. The jungle provides everything: insects rich with flavor, water from vines, a temperature that asks nothing of you, and the constant, enveloping greenness that makes it possible to never see the horizon. There is no horizon in the jungle. That is perhaps the most important detail. Without a horizon, there is nowhere the eye travels to that reminds you of elsewhere, nothing that opens onto the question of what might be waiting beyond the green. Timon has taught him to laugh at things that once would have made him cry. The absurdity of eating bugs the size of his own paw, the ridiculous dignity of a warthog, the infinite ridiculousness of existence itself, which, Timon says, is the whole secret to not drowning in it. Pumbaa, quieter and steadier, has taught him something different, that you can simply exist alongside someone without needing to become anything, without needing to matter, without the exhausting architecture of purpose. With Pumbaa, Simba has learned to walk through the forest without trying to own it or understand it, and there is a tremendous relief in that surrender. He does not think anymore about the gorge, about hooves, about his father's voice calling his name in a chaos he could not order or fix. When those memories surface, and they do, usually in the half-sleep of dusk when his mind is less guarded, he has learned to let them move through him like wind through grass, leaving no impression, changing nothing. This is what Hakuna Matata has really taught him. Not that the past didn't happen, but that you don't have to live in it. You can live in the eternal, perfect present of the jungle instead. And so he has, for 4 years, and it has worked. He is larger now, a young lion in his physical prime, his muscles lean and strong from play and simple living, his face unmarked by the weight of knowledge or responsibility. Sometimes he catches his own reflection in still water and is almost surprised by how peaceful his own eyes look. The cubs who come to play with him, young animals born in the jungle since his arrival, do not see a prince or an heir or a boy haunted by guilt. They see only Simba, who will wrestle with them and teach them songs that Timon has written, simple nonsense songs about food and friendship that contain nothing of the past. Meanwhile, across the jungle, something is happening that Simba does not see because his eyes are not looking that direction anymore, because to look would be to acknowledge the existence of the direction itself. Nala comes and goes, has come and gone more frequently as the years have passed, and he has learned not to ask where she goes or for how long, not to wonder at the thinness of her sometimes when she returns, not to notice the particular weight in her eyes that grows heavier each time. He loves her. That part has remained simple and true, but love in the jungle has learned not to be the kind of love that demands understanding or explanation. When she is there, they are together. When she is gone, the jungle fills the space with abundance and distraction. When she returns, they are together again. There is a pattern to it, but Simba has learned not to call the pattern anything that would require him to name its meaning. The jungle is good at teaching you this, how to let things be what they are without naming them, without asking them to mean. In the 5th year, Nala's absences become longer, and Simba notices this in the way one notices a shift in the weather. Something has changed, but you do not consider whether the change is permanent or what its causes might be. He simply adjusts to her absence the way he has adjusted to everything else, by accepting it and moving forward into the next moment. Timon, who is sharper about these things, does sometimes venture to ask whether everything is all right with her, whether she seems troubled, whether maybe they should talk about something. But Timon has learned, over the years with Simba, that some conversations are best not started, and so he lets it go. Hakuna Matata does not require explanations. It requires only that you stop looking for problems. And Simba, who has become very good at this, simply stops looking. By the 6th year, there is a quality to his contentment that has begun to feel almost spiritual. He has truly forgotten that there was ever anything other than this. The jungle, Timon, Pumba, the insects, the water, the green, and Nala's occasional return like rain. He does not think about Pride Rock anymore. The name itself has become a thing with no meaning, like a word in a language he no longer speaks. He does not think about the gorge, or the stampede, or the voice of his father crying his name. These are things that happened to someone else, a Simba who was smaller and sadder and more alone, and that Simba is gone now, replaced by this larger, stronger, peaceful creature who understands that the goal of life is not to matter, but to rest. And resting is what he does. But what Simba does not see, what his willful peace has made it possible for him not to see, is that while he has been resting, the pride lands. The actual, physical place where his mother still lives, where lionesses are slowly starving, where the bones of herds killed by hunger have begun to bleach white under a sun that has not brought rain in years. This place has been collapsing in a way that his peace in the jungle makes possible. Scar rules unchallenged, because the heir who might have challenged him has chosen amnesia over reclamation. The hyenas hunt without restraint, because there is no one to teach them the circle of life's careful boundaries. The savannah dries, because no one who remembers what it once was has either the will or the power to restore it. And Nala, who carries the memory of all of this, who has been trying to work against it in secret for years now, continues to walk between two worlds, the jungle of forgetting and the dying kingdom that will not let her forget. She has not told Simba what she is doing because she knows what Hakuna Matata will say. The past is not his responsibility, the future is not his concern. Why burden himself with knowing? And he would be right, in the terms the jungle understands right. But the kingdom would still be dying. There is something almost elegant about how the system works. Simba's peace and Scar's tyranny are, in a way, the same thing, the same refusal to engage with the world's weight. And the difference between them is only that Scar has chosen to rule while refusing to care, whereas Simba has chosen to disappear entirely. Both lead to the same outcome. And in the jungle at night, under stars that do not judge, Simba sleeps peacefully while the world beyond the green falls slowly, quietly, into darkness. In the 7th year of Scar's reign, there was a moment, I think you could pinpoint it if you had been there to see it, when the Pride Land's slow collapse became something the lionesses could no longer endure in silence. The herds had stopped coming at all by then. They had learned, as prey learns, that this land was no longer safe, that the careful balance Mufasa had kept was gone. What remained were bones, scattered across drying grasslands like a language no one wanted to read. Sarabi sat at the mouth of Pride Rock one morning. This would have been in the dry season, when heat shimmers made distance look like water, and realized she could count on one paw the number of gazelle they had taken that week. One paw. Her daughters were thin in a way that made their ribs visible when they breathed, and the hyenas, for all their vast numbers, had begun to turn their hunger toward each other, a violence that spread like disease through their ranks. Scar, from his throne, watched all of it with an expression that flickered between rage and something almost like satisfaction, as though the destruction of the kingdom proved something he had always believed about power. The lionesses began to speak in low voices during the night hunts, voices so quiet that even Nala, when she arrived in secret to strengthen their resolve, had to lean close to hear. They spoke of starvation as a kind of drowning. They spoke of Scar's strikes against Sarabi, each one a fresh wound to their collective dignity. They spoke of memories of water that flowed, of herds that came without needing to be tracked across impossible distances. What they did not speak of, because they did not know it, was that somewhere beyond the borders Simba was alive, that the air they mourned was living in abundance while they starved. I find myself thinking about that asymmetry a great deal, the way hope and despair can exist in the same moment, separated only by distance and a decision no one could have predicted. Nala moved among them like a ghost with a heartbeat, a figure they had known as a cub, now returned like a memory made tangible, and the simple fact of her presence seemed to say, resistance is not impossible. She did not make speeches. She was too careful for that, too aware that Scar's paranoia had begun to flower into genuine madness, that his spies watched from every shadow. Instead she worked, with Zazu's coded messages and Sarabi's quiet authority, to reshape what remained of the Pride's hunting patterns, to remind them of the old efficiency, the old discipline, the old understanding that lionesses were not prey but hunters. There was something almost sacred in that work, I think, the slow reconstruction of a self that tyranny had tried to erase. But as the seasons turned, and the land grew worse, something else began to happen in the hearts of the starving lionesses. Desperation is a kind of clarity, you understand. It burns away the small fears, the careful calculations, and leaves only the large ones. The fear of slow death, the fear of children becoming too weak to run, the fear that surrender is what remaining means. In the 10th month of that year, during a night when the hyenas were distracted by an argument over what little meat remained, some of the younger lionesses began to speak openly of what Nala had only been suggesting in whispers. What if they stopped asking permission to live? What if the circle of lionesses, starving and desperate, and skilled in the arts of the hunt, simply refused Scar's rule? It was Sarabi who first put words to the mathematical reality of it. There were 37 lionesses, she said, and perhaps 400 hyenas, but the hyenas were scattered, hungry, quarrelsome, and the lionesses still remembered how to move together. The odds were not good. They were, by any honest calculation, terrible. But the outcome of remaining was a certainty. Slow death, the end of the Pride, the erasure of everything Mufasa had built. Nala listened to these conversations with a weight in her chest that felt almost like drowning, because she understood, in a way that perhaps only she could understand, what was being asked of her. The lionesses were gathering themselves for something that had never been done in their world, a true rebellion, a challenge not from a competing male, which tradition almost comprehended, but from within the Pride itself, a fracturing of hierarchy that went deeper than politics. They were asking her to be not just a symbol, but a leader. They were asking her to step into the role that had been chosen for her before she was born, the role she had abandoned in the jungle, the role she had begun to rebuild in secret. She was 23 years old, if you counted the years in the usual way, though some of those years had been lived in forgetting and some in remembering, and the weight of an entire kingdom rested now on the decision she would have to make very soon. There is a moment, I think, in every story of this kind, a moment when the individual choices that seem to matter stop mattering quite so much, and the shape of something larger, something that has been gathering in the dark, becomes impossible to ignore. The Pride lands had been waiting for that moment for 7 years. The lionesses had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting. Scar in his throne room at Pride Rock was waiting too, though he would have called it vigilance, the constant, exhausting work of maintaining power through fear, of listening to every shadow for the sound of rebellion. He had begun to talk to the bones that Zazu sometimes left, speaking to them as though they might answer, ordering them to stay dead, as though the past could be murdered a second time if only he refused it hard enough. The kingdom was balanced on an edge so sharp that no one on either side could have said, with any certainty, which way it would fall when the first true challenge came. What I know is this: the starvation that Scar had dismissed as natural, as inevitable, as the circle of life punishing weakness, had become something else entirely, a forge, where desperation and skill and love for a home that was dying began to fuse into something that had no name yet but was preparing to be born. The lionesses were broken, but not yet beaten, and in that narrow space between breaking and defeat, hope, a different kind of hope than Simba knew in his jungle forgetting, was gathering its strength. By the 7th year of exile, a particular kind of silence had fallen over the Pride lands, the silence that comes not from peace, but from the absence of anyone with the power to speak back. Scar ruled alone at Pride Rock, or so the surface claimed, but rumor, that oldest and most insistent of kingdoms, had begun to move through the savannah in ways even he could not entirely control. It started, as these things often do, with a question that someone asked aloud in a place they thought was safe. What if the heir did not die in the gorge? What if Simba survived? Zazu had been singing it for years now, coded into the mournful melody Scar demanded every evening, a pattern of notes that sounded like grief but meant something else entirely to those who had learned to listen underneath the surface. The old majordomo, imprisoned in his skull cage, had become a kind of living archive of the old kingdom, and his songs carried the weight of testimony. Sarabi, Mufasa's widow, had never stopped believing it either. She could feel it in the way a mother feels the breath of her cub, even when he is distant, even when he is gone from her sight. But it was Rafiki the shaman who gave the rumor its true shape, its mythic weight. In his baobab tree at the edge of Pride Rock, in that sacred space where the old magic still lingered despite Scar's best efforts to strangle it, Rafiki had begun to paint. He painted Simba's face, the young lion as he might be now, grown and changed, but unmistakably the heir. And he left these images where wind and wandering eyes might find them, small declarations that the line of succession was not broken, that legitimacy itself had not simply vanished into the stampede. There is something in the act of witness that matters more than the accuracy of what is witnessed. Rafiki was a witness, and his witnessing made the rumor real in a way that facts alone could never do. The rumor traveled through the lionesses first, as most truths do in a kingdom where lionesses hunt and males sleep. It traveled through the conversations held in the shadow of Pride Rock, where Sarabi moved among them like a living ghost, speaking not directly, but through the strength of her refusal to bend. It traveled into the hyena camps, where a few of the younger among them, those who had begun to question whether never going hungry again had been an actual promise or merely a lie that Scar had told them in the days when his voice still carried absolute conviction. And from the hyenas, inevitably, it reached Scar himself. He did not hear it as rumor, he heard it as insurgency. He heard it as the sound of his kingship being picked at from the inside, thread by thread. The careful lies he had built his throne upon being slowly, systematically unraveled. The thing about paranoia is that it does not arrive quietly. It comes as a kind of violent awakening, a sudden certainty that the world around you has been secretly conspiring all along. Scar began to order the hyenas to hunt for Simba in the borderlands, though the borderlands had grown so barren and lifeless that there was little left to hunt, except the rumor itself. He demanded that Shenzi investigate, that Banzai track any sign, that even Ed, strange, quiet Ed, keep his ears open for any whisper of the lost heir. What he did not understand, what his paranoia prevented him from fully grasping, was that the hyenas had become as starving and desperate as the lionesses they terrorized, and that a living heir was beginning to mean something to them too. It meant, perhaps, a king who might restore the herds, who might feed them again, who might represent an alternative to this slow starvation that Scar's rule had become. The rumor was growing teeth. In the jungle, of course, Simba knew nothing of any of this. He lived in abundance that had become, over 7 years, nearly absolute. Fruit that did not fail, streams that did not dry, a world that asked nothing of him except that he be present to it. Timon and Pumbaa, his companions in exile, had long ago stopped asking him about his past, stopped expecting him to be anyone other than who he had become. a young lion who laughed easily and carried no memory like a weight. Nala, when she returned from her secret journeys to the dying kingdom, brought with her the weight of what he would not carry, the knowledge of what his absence had wrought. She did not speak of it directly. There was a kind of mercy in her silence, but it lived in her eyes, in the way she held herself differently after each return, in the subtle transformations that Simba had learned through Hakuna Matata's careful teaching not to interrogate. She was becoming a stranger to him, and he was learning to let her become one. But the rumor, once it begins to move, will move regardless of who knows it. By the 7th year, a Scar standing on Pride Rock could feel the ground beneath his paws becoming less solid, less certain. The hyena's obedience, once absolute, had begun to fracture along the lines of hunger and hope. The lioness's submission, never truly genuine, had hardened into something colder and more dangerous. The patient waiting of those who sense that change is coming, whether they will it or not. And somewhere in the jungle, in a place Scar could not reach and did not know to look, a young lion named Simba existed, alive, unaware, impossibly precious to a kingdom that was beginning to believe in him with the fervor of desperate prayer. The Phantom King was more powerful in his absence than any ruling monarch could be in his presence, and Scar's throne had begun, already, to shake beneath him. This is what happens when a lie grows old enough to be questioned, when people begin to understand that the death they were told about might never have occurred at all. The rumor would not kill him, but it would change everything that came after. 7 years into exile, Nala stands at the border between two worlds, and the weight of that standing is beginning to break her in half. She has spent these years walking between the jungle, where Simba sleeps in willful peace, and the dying Pride lands, where her mother's bones may already be scattered in the dust. The Nala who left Pride Rock was a girl who loved Simba more than she feared abandonment. The Nala standing here now is someone else entirely, someone who has learned that love and duty do not always point in the same direction, and that choosing one often means losing the other. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from understanding something that the person you love most refuses to understand, and Nala has been living in that loneliness for years. When she returns to the jungle from her reconnaissance missions, from the bone-scattered wastelands, from the dried watering hole, from Zazu's coded warnings and Sarabi's unbending defiance, Simba does not ask where she has been. He knows somehow not to ask, the way you learn not to ask difficult questions of people you wish would stay, and that mercy, that kindness, is part of what makes it unbearable. Because she wants him to ask, she wants him to care enough to ask, and his careful, loving decision not to know is perhaps the most loving thing he could do and the most isolating. In the jungle, Hakuna Matata has taught him that worrying about the future is a form of suffering you can simply choose not to inflict on yourself, and he has learned the lesson so well that he has become someone who does not worry about anything at all. He does not worry that his mother might be starving. He does not wonder whether his name still means something in a kingdom that no longer exists. He does not imagine that there might be a lioness out there who chose him and is now choosing him again, every time she comes back from the wasteland, and does not tell him why her eyes carry weight. Nala, by contrast, has learned something else entirely from these years. She has learned that forgetting is a choice, and that it is a choice she cannot make. She has tried to make it, tried to sit beside Simba under the stars and let Hakuna Matata empty her mind the way it has emptied his. But her mother's face will not leave her, and neither will the image of Sarabi's weakened frame, and neither will Zazu's eyes when he realized that someone from the old world had come back looking for him. What Zazu gave her, in that meeting among the ruins, was permission to consider something that had never seemed possible before, that perhaps Simba was not the answer, or not the only answer, or not the answer in the way she had imagined. What Zazu gave her was the knowledge that the pride was not yet dead, that Sarabi held the older lionesses to some invisible thread of resistance, that the hyena's hunger was making them question their loyalty, That if someone were to move at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right people, the tide could turn. And the person who could move at that moment was her. Nala, who had abandoned her destiny as future queen, has slowly, in the margins of years and secret journeys, been building a different kind of destiny entirely. She has spent months mapping Scar's paranoia, learning which lionesses would stand, understanding the fractures in the hyena coalition that Scar had never bothered to secure because he had always relied on fear. And fear, as it turns out, is a loyalty held together only by certainty of power. When Scar began to doubt, fear turned to hunger, and hunger turns hyenas towards simpler solutions than allegiance to a paranoid king. There is a night, 7 years into exile, when Nala lies beside Simba in the jungle and understands with the clarity of something that has been building for a long time that she cannot stay. They are curled together beneath a tree whose branches have learned the shape of them, whose roots have grown around their sleeping bodies across seasons enough that the jungle itself seems to have decided to hold them in place. Simba is dreaming of nothing, the way he has learned to dream, a mind emptied of content, a spirit at rest in the present moment, a lion who has successfully forgotten that there was ever a lion he was meant to become. And Nala is lying awake in the dark, and she is thinking about her mother's face, and about Sarabi's refusal to break, and about the lionesses whose hunger is teaching them that resistance is possible, and she is thinking about what it will cost to say what she is about to say. The choice in front of her is not between Simba and the kingdom, though that is how her mind tries to frame it, trying to make it binary, trying to make there be a right answer. The choice is between two kinds of betrayal: the betrayal of the kingdom that no longer has anyone to speak for it, or the betrayal of the lion she loves most in the world, who will not understand why she is choosing the kingdom that he has learned to forget. If she returns to the jungle and stays, she stays complicit in a slow death that she is capable of preventing. If she returns and leads the rebellion that is gathering in the spaces between the lioness's hunger and their courage, she loses Simba, not immediately, not in a sudden moment, but in the way that distance is lost. Gradually, across distances too small to see in any single moment, until one day you turn around and the person you left behind is no longer visible. And Simba, she understands this with terrible clarity, will not choose to follow her into that work, because Simba has made his choice, and his choice was forgetting. The circle of life that she was born into teaches that all things are connected, that you cannot separate the fate of a single lion from the fate of a kingdom, that a king who looks away is a king who participates in the dying. Hakuna Matata teaches that this is a form of suffering you can choose not to inflict on yourself. These philosophies are incompatible in a way that makes her understand, finally, that the love that brought them both into exile is not the same as the love that will hold them together through what comes next. So on a night 7 years into hiding, Nala makes the choice that has been becoming inevitable for a long time now, the choice she has been secretly preparing for through months of visits and coded conversations and careful mapping of resistance, the choice that will cost her everything she built in exile. She decides to stay, not in the jungle, but in the borderlands, in the margins of the dying kingdom, where Zazu has taught her the language of resistance, and where Sarabi and the lionesses are beginning to whisper the word that no one has said aloud for 7 years: rebellion. She understands what this choice will mean for her and Simba, and she makes it anyway, because she is the daughter of a lioness who chose her kingdom, and because in the end, that inheritance is stronger than exile, and because some choices you make not in the moment when they seem possible, but in the moment when they become necessary, and this moment, with the pride on the breaking point and Scar growing paranoid and the hyena's loyalty fracturing, is the moment when it becomes necessary. When she tells Simba, she will try to make him understand that this is not about him, that her love for him has not changed, that she is not choosing the kingdom over him, but choosing to save both if she can, choosing to fight rather than wait, choosing to be the queen that she was born to be while she still has time to become her. But she already knows what his answer will be, because she knows Simba, has known him his entire life, and she knows that he does not know yet how to want what he has not let himself imagine. And so Nala stands at the border between two worlds, between the jungle and the wasteland, between the lion she loves and the kingdom that is calling for her, between the daughter she was and the queen she has become. And she takes the first step toward the only choice that will let her live with herself. 7 years into exile, Nala stands at the border of the Pride Lands at dawn, watching the wasteland she came from, and understands that the moment of choosing has finally arrived. She has spent months moving secretly among the lionesses, mapping Scar's paranoia, learning the hyena patrols, understanding the slow fracturing of the alliance that holds the kingdom together through fear and hunger alone. Sarabi still moves through Pride Rock with her head high, refusing Scar's bed, refusing to legitimize his rule through queenship. And that refusal has become an anchor for every lioness who questions whether this wasteland is truly the kingdom they inherited. The hyenas are starving now, truly starving, and the hunger is beginning to do what fear never could. It is making them doubt whether serving Scar is worth the price they are paying. In her secret meetings with Zazu, still imprisoned in his skull cage, but communicating through coded songs and careful whispers, Nala has learned that the old Majordomo believes the time for hidden resistance is ending. Something is about to break. She thinks often of Simba in the jungle, sleeping peacefully in abundance while she carries the weight of a kingdom that cannot sleep, and she understands now that this was always going to be the cost of her choice. On a night 7 years into her secret war against Scar, Nala walks openly to Pride Rock for the first time since her covert resistance began, and she does not walk alone. Behind her move lionesses, Sarabi at the center, unguarded because Scar no longer fears them or has not yet understood that he should. And with them comes the weight of every starving cub, every hunted conversation, every tiny act of defiance that has accumulated in the shadows. The hyenas see them coming and hesitate. They are guards, but they are also hungry, and they have begun to wonder what they are guarding and why. Nala climbs to the stone where Scar holds court, where Mufasa once ruled before him, and she does not growl or roar. She speaks, and her voice carries the peculiar authority of someone who has nothing left to lose because she gave everything away 7 years ago. "I am Nala," she says to the assembled pride, to the hyenas watching from the shadows, to Scar who stares at her with the dawning understanding that his fear has never been enough. "I am not of the royal bloodline," she continues, and there is something in that admission that makes the moment heavier, not lighter, because she is claiming authority not through birth, but through bearing witness. "I have watched this kingdom die," she says, and every lioness who hears her knows that she means it literally, that she has walked the borderlands and seen the bones and the dust and the slow suffocation of everything they were born to. 7 years ago, Scar told us that both Mufasa and Simba perished in a stampede, and we believed him because we were frightened, and grief makes us vulnerable to the stories we are told. But I have seen beyond the borders, and I can tell you that the stampede was no accident, that a king does not simply watch his brother run his son into danger and call it fate. There is a long silence, the kind that holds more weight than shouting ever could, because it is the silence of a pride beginning to understand that the story they have been told is not the only story that exists. Scar rises, and his voice when it comes is not rage, but something closer to despair. A dictator recognizing that the ground beneath his throne is no longer solid, that legitimacy, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. "You dare to question my rule," he hisses, and Nala does not flinch, because she has already lost everything that matters to her, and there is freedom in that. "I do not question," she says quietly, "I testify." The hyenas begin to move, but they move slowly, hesitant, and in that hesitation, Nala sees the moment she has been building toward for 7 years of hidden work. The lionesses do not charge, do not roar. They simply stand united, and in their unity is a force more powerful than any individual strength could ever be. Scar understands, in that moment, that he has been king only so long as no one was brave enough to say otherwise, that his whole reign was built on the unspoken agreement of terrified subjects. And now someone has spoken, and the silence after her speaking is the sound of a kingdom beginning to crack. The hyenas back away, because they are mercenaries, and mercenaries do not fight when their employer's power visibly fractures, and because some of them, in the deepest part of their hunger, have begun to remember that there are other prides, other leaders, other ways to survive that do not require serving a king who has failed them. Nala does not celebrate in that moment. She feels only the weight of what she has just begun, and the knowledge that Simba, sleeping in the jungle in his chosen forgetfulness, will have no idea that his kingdom is waking up without him. She has spoken for the pride, and in speaking for them, she has severed the last thread that could have held her to the life she abandoned 7 years ago. The rebellion has begun not with violence but with testimony, with one lioness standing in the place where kings are crowned and saying simply, "This is not enough, and we remember something better." Behind her, Sarabi's eyes shine with something that might be hope, might be relief, might be the awful recognition that salvation sometimes comes at the cost of everything else you love. Nala turns to face Scar directly, and in her eyes is the knowledge that a throne held by fear will fall to a voice steady enough to speak the truth, that legitimacy, in the end, is built on the consent of the proud to be ruled, and that consent, once withdrawn, cannot be forced back into place. She is a rebel queen now, though she has claimed no throne and wears no crown, because the power she holds is not the power to command, but the power to be listened to be believed, to speak what the pride has always known, but been too afraid to say aloud. For 7 years, Simba has lived in the jungle as though the world began the day he arrived there, as though before Hakuna Matata there was only void and forgetting. Timon and Pumbaa have been extraordinarily patient with him, and I mean that. They have asked nothing of him except that he stop asking questions of himself. It is a philosophy designed precisely for people like him, people carrying something too heavy to name, who need permission to set it down. One afternoon, as Simba lies half asleep in dappled sunlight, a mandrill shaman appears at the jungle's edge, Rafiki, whom Simba has never met, yet who moves as though he knows exactly where to find him. The old ape carries with him the dust of the Pride Lands, the dry air that Simba has learned not to think about, and he brings urgent news. Nala has returned to the kingdom, not to hide, but to lead a rebellion. The message carries weight that even Hakuna Matata cannot entirely dissolve. The lioness he left behind has stepped into the role of leader that was never hers to take, and the kingdom is rising. Simba's first response is the one Hakuna Matata has trained him for, to let it pass, to return to the moment, to refuse the weight. But there is something in the knowledge that Nala is fighting without him that breaks through the amnesia like a thorn through silk. Rafiki watches him with an expression that contains neither judgment nor patience, only a kind of knowing. The old shaman has seen many kings try to run from their thrones, and he has never seen it work. Over the following days, messengers arrive at the jungle's threshold, some sent by Zazu, some by rebel lionesses who have learned where Simba is hidden, some simply by the movements of the wind, which carries news like it carries seeds. The Pride Lands are rising, they say, but the rebellion is fragile without the rightful heir. Scar is fracturing under pressure, but still dangerous, and Nala, who has borne the weight of resistance alone for months, is growing exhausted. Each messenger is a small rupture in the careful forgetting, a reminder that the world outside the jungle has not stopped existing simply because Simba stopped living in it. He finds himself asking Timon and Pumbaa questions for the first time in years. What does it mean to have power you never wanted? What does it mean to abandon people because you are afraid? Pumbaa, in his gentle way, says that sometimes the right answer and the comfortable answer are not the same thing, and that knowing the difference is what separates those who can live with themselves from those who cannot. Timon, ever the pragmatist, points out that Hakuna Matata works beautifully when you are running from something. It works rather less well when you are running from someone, and Nala is someone. The nights become difficult in a way they have not been since Simba first arrived in the jungle, young and broken. He dreams of Nala as she was, fierce, loyal, unwilling to let him disappear into his own guilt, and he wakes wondering who she has become in the years he chose not to know her. One night, sitting alone by the water's edge, Simba sees his reflection and is startled by how much he resembles Mufasa, not in the way he looked when he was alive, but in the way a king looks when he finally understands the weight of his absence. There is a moment, I think, that comes for every person who has tried to escape responsibility, when the escape reveals itself as a kind of cruelty, not because running away is always wrong, but because staying away becomes wrong the moment others pay the price. For Simba, that moment arrives on the night he stands at the jungle's edge and feels the dry wind from the Pride lands for the first time in years, carrying with it the dust and the desperation of a kingdom that has waited long enough. He remembers Mufasa teaching him about the circle of life, about how every creature plays a role, about how a king's responsibility is not optional but woven into the very fabric of existence. He understands, finally, that Hakuna Matata means no worries, but that no worries is only a philosophy when no one you love is worrying on your behalf. Nala did not have the luxury of choosing forgetting because she loved him enough to carry the weight he set down. She carried it for both of them while he learned to laugh at insects in a jungle that was never truly his home. The choice before him now is not whether to be a king. He has always been a king, and the kingdom has always been his, whether he accepted it or not. The choice is whether the love he feels for Nala is strong enough to pull him back across the years of distance, and whether he can face the truth about his father's death and his own role in it. He thinks about what Rafiki said, about how the past can hurt but you can learn from it, and he understands that this is not comfort, it is truth. As the night deepens, Simba makes the decision that years of Hakuna Matata have tried to delay. He will leave the jungle, not because duty demands it, but because Nala is there, and she matters more than his peace. He will return to a kingdom he helped destroy by his absence, and he will have to face the question that has haunted him since he was a cub, whether forgiveness is possible when the damage has been done. It is not a happy realization. There is nothing light or easy about stepping back into the weight he set down 7 years ago. But as he looks back at the jungle one final time, understanding that he is choosing a harder life, Simba also understands that sometimes the only way to truly live is to stop running. The kingdom is waiting, Nala is fighting, and a lion cannot hide forever in paradise while his people burn. He gathers himself, and he begins to walk toward home. On the night Scar dies, 2 paths that diverged 7 years before in the darkness finally converge again at the summit of Pride Rock, and what meets there is not quite what either of them expected when they fled into exile so long ago. Simba stands at the peak of his ancestral home, chest heaving, the roar still echoing from his throat, the roar that reclaims not just a throne, but an identity he spent years learning to forget. And Nala is there, bloodied from the battle with the hyenas, her eyes meeting his with recognition so complete it seems to contain both joy and sorrow at once. There is a moment, brief and strange, where they simply look at each other across the space between them, and in that silence is everything that cannot fit into words. The 7 years apart, the different forms their love took in separation, the fact that they have both become people the other did not expect. Simba has returned as a king, driven by guilt and duty and Rafiki's insistent wisdom and the memory of his father's spirit burning in the sky. But also, and this matters, driven by the knowledge that Nala was leading a kingdom without him, that she had stopped waiting for him to become himself and had become herself instead. Nala has returned as a leader, a focal point of resistance, a lioness who learned that sometimes love means letting go, that duty and devotion are not the same thing, that a kingdom can rise on the backs of those who refuse to forget. When Simba finally crosses the space between them, it is not the same as their reunion in the jungle. That moment of rediscovery, tender and private, when they had briefly allowed themselves to imagine they could simply choose each other and have it be enough. This embrace happens in front of the entire pride, in front of the assembled witnesses to what they have become, and it carries the weight of a choice rather than the lightness of an escape. The problem, and this is what hangs unspoken over the triumph, is that Simba and Nala have been apart so long that they have each, in their own way, learned to be alone. Simba in the jungle learned to be content with very little: insects and starlight, and the council of friends who asked nothing of him except that he stop remembering. Nala in the dying Pride lands learned to be whole without him: strategic, courageous, capable of carrying weight that would have crushed her if she had waited for rescue. And now the kingdom needs both of them, needs them to rule together, needs them to be not just lovers, but partners in the terrible work of restoration. The hyenas are gone, driven off by their own hunger and Scar's final betrayal. He blamed them for the famine even as he starved them alongside the Pride, a miscalculation of loyalty that cost him everything. But what remains is not a kingdom waiting to be healed. It is a kingdom that has learned to endure on its own, that has been shaped by years of deprivation into something harder and more brittle than what Mufasa left behind. Pride Rock itself bears this transformation visibly. Bones still line its slopes, the stone is dark with soot from the fires of the battle, and there is a smell of ash and char that will not leave for months. The savannah beyond is littered with the small remains of the famine. Bleached stone where the watering hole ran dry, grass that has not yet remembered how to grow, prey herds that fled and must be somehow called home. And Simba, looking out over all of this, his kingdom, his responsibility, his inheritance, has the look of someone who has suddenly understood that forgetting was always a kind of luxury, available only to those with the choice to leave. Nala, standing beside him, understands this without needing to be told, because she has been living without that luxury for 7 years. In the days that follow the confrontation, and this is where the real story begins, not where it ends, Simba and Nala must learn to rule together across a gulf of separation that a single battle and a single embrace cannot bridge. The Pride gathers for the formal coronation, and there is confusion about what it should look like, because Simba is undeniably king by blood, but Nala has been the acting heart of resistance, the one whose courage gave others permission to rebel. Some of the older lionesses speak carefully of a dual rule, of Nala as co-regent rather than consort, but Simba, still learning how to be king, is uncertain whether this is tradition or whether it is something new that the Pride has earned through its suffering. There is a moment when Zazu, released from his long imprisonment, offers guidance about protocol, but even Zazu is not entirely sure what the law should be when the heir returns as a stranger to a kingdom that has been kept alive by the lioness he loves. Timon and Pumbaa, who travelled with Simba through the fire and the battle, and stood at his side when his courage nearly failed, now find themselves oddly out of place at Pride Rock, outsiders in a way they never were in the jungle. And Rafiki, the shaman who nudged Simba toward his destiny, watches the young king and queen with an expression that suggests he knows something about the cost of kingship that neither of them has yet fully understood. The circle of life, which Mufasa taught Simba represented balance and interdependence, is not a circle at all when you are the one responsible for maintaining it. It is a wheel that turns relentlessly, indifferent to whether you are ready or tired or grieving the version of yourself that was left behind in exile. Nala does not resent Simba for the years of absence, or rather, the resentment, when it surfaces in the quiet darkness, is complicated by too much love to be clean. She resents what his absence allowed, the suffering she had to endure alone, the leadership she had to claim because no one else could. And Simba, trying to learn kingship from scratch in a kingdom he does not recognize, sometimes looks at Nala with something like guilt, because he knows that without her, without the resistance she led, without her refusal to forget or forgive Scar, he would still be in the jungle eating insects and laughing at the world's weight. But there is no space to speak this, not yet, maybe not ever, because there is a kingdom that needs them both, and the need is immediate and relentless. The rains come, and the first thing Simba and Nala do as joint rulers is open the territory for grazing and migration, allowing the prey herds to return, allowing the circle of life to begin its restoration. It is not a dramatic act. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is simply the undoing of Scar's refusal, the reversal of a tyrant's decision to hoard and control. And as the savannah begins to green, as water returns to the watering hole, as the air loses the smell of ash and begins to hold the scent of growth, Simba and Nala learn, very slowly, to be rulers together. They are different people now, both of them, and the kingdom they inherit is different too, harder and more aware of its own fragility. But in the evenings, when the work is done and they stand together on the promontory of Pride Rock, looking out over their restored domain, there are moments when the separation seems to fade, when the years fall away, when it is possible to believe that two people who loved each other enough to leave might also love each other enough to rebuild what their leaving damaged. It is not the same as what they imagined in the jungle, and it is not the same as what either of them expected when they made the choice to flee into exile. But perhaps, and this is what those quiet evenings suggest, it is enough. It is, at least, the only thing they have. In the days immediately after Scar's death, after the flames died and the hyenas scattered like smoke, the Pride lands entered a silence so complete it was almost another form of violence, the silence of a kingdom trying to remember how to breathe. Simba stood at the edge of Pride Rock in the early morning, watching the first rain fall in years, and something in his face suggested he was waiting for this moment to feel like relief, and was discovering it did not. The rains had come, yes, dark clouds and blessed water soaking into soil that had forgotten what moisture felt like. But they fell on a landscape littered with bones, on a pride that had lost too much, on a lion king who had returned too late. Nala found him there, and they stood together in the rain without speaking, because there was no language yet for what they had each become in their separation. She had been a queen in the darkness, moving through the kingdom's collapse with purpose and secret hope, believing that if she could only hold on long enough, if she could only keep the resistance alive, everything would be saved when the heir returned. He had been a wanderer in abundance, learning to forget his name and his blood, building a life in a jungle that asked nothing of him except that he remain. Now they stood together under the rain that was supposed to heal everything, and it was healing nothing. Over the following days, as the Pride began the terrible accounting, the lionesses that did not return from hunts, the cubs born and starved under Scar's reign, the mothers who had given everything and been given nothing in return, Simba felt something in him begin to crack that the fire had not broken. He had returned as the hero, the king who had vanquished the tyrant, and he was discovering that this had never been what was needed. What was needed was for him to have never left. What was needed was for him not to have spent 7 years forgetting, while his kingdom starved. Sarabi came to him on the 3rd day, and her eyes held a weight that no words could carry, and she did not embrace him as a son returning home, but rather stood before him as a queen who had survived something he could not begin to comprehend. She told him carefully about the lionesses lost to hunger, to hyena violence, to despair. And Simba understood with a clarity that felt like drowning that every name she spoke was a failure. He had inherited the moment his father died in the gorge. Nala, in her own way, was fragmenting differently. She had returned to the kingdom as a rebel, as a symbol of resistance, and had been received with an intensity of hope that had frightened her even as she bore it. The lionesses had believed in her because they had to believe in something, because to stop believing was to accept that they and their cubs would simply die in the dust. Now that hope had been answered, now that the tyrant was gone and the rain had come, She was discovering that she could not simply transform back into the future queen that everyone assumed she still was. She had lived too long in the margins, had breathed resistance and grief in the dark, had become someone other than the young lioness who had fled Pride Rock 7 years ago. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from the gap between what you expected to feel and what you actually feel when you finally arrive at the moment you have been working toward. And Nala was learning that grief in the quiet of the rebuilt pride, in the space between the lioness's gratitude and her own hollow exhaustion. Simba, meanwhile, was learning a different version of the same terrible lesson. He had been told that returning would set everything right, that his presence would heal the kingdom, that love and courage and the right blood would be enough to restore the circle of life. But the circle of life could not be restored in an instant. It could not be stitched back together with a coronation and a rain shower and the death of a tyrant. In the weeks after Scar's fall, the Pride lands did begin to show signs of recovery, the first green shoots pushing through the cracked earth, the first small herds venturing back from the borderlands. But it was a recovery that would take years, perhaps decades, and would require the constant attention and sacrifice of lions who were themselves broken and grieving. Zazu, released from his bone cage at last, moved through Pride Rock as though he had forgotten how to exist in a space where he was not imprisoned, where his every movement was not a performance for a tyrant's amusement. He had served Simba's father, and then he had served the kingdom by surviving in darkness, and now he found himself uncertain what it meant to simply serve the new king. This young lion who had returned full of intention and guilt, and a kind of desperate hope that the past could be unmade by force of will. It could not. Rafiki, watching from the margins as he always did, seemed unsurprised by the hollowness of victory, seemed to understand, perhaps, that the moment the king and queen stood together at the cliff's edge, drenched in rain, was less a triumph than a beginning of a different, slower kind of reckoning. On the night of Simba's coronation, which came so quickly after Scar's death that it felt almost obscene to Nala, she stood beside him before the entire pride and the dawn, and they were crowned together as joint monarchs, a choice made in the heat of immediate aftermath, a gesture toward her role in the rebellion and her blood as the heir's chosen queen. But even as the pride roared their approval, even as Kiara was presented at the cliff's edge to continue the circle and suggest that the world would simply move forward into its next generation, Simba and Nala understood something that was not spoken aloud, that they had each paid a price for the kingdom's salvation, and that price lived in them now in ways that would not heal with the rain. He had abandoned the kingdom and spent years forgetting. She had abandoned him and spent years remembering. Now they were meant to rule together across that gulf of different sufferings, different kinds of survival, different understandings of what it meant to be alive at all. The Pride lands would recover, yes. The grass would return, the herds would multiply, the circle of life would wheel forward as it always did, indifferent to the specific griefs of specific lions. But Simba and Nala would carry the cost of that recovery in their bodies and their choices for the rest of their lives, and they would discover, slowly, that being together again was not the same as being healed together, and that sometimes love is not enough to bridge the distance between two people who have lived through the same catastrophe in completely different ways. In the weeks that followed Scar's death and the first rains, the Pride lands began to green again in a way that looked almost like forgiveness, as if the land itself had been waiting for permission to live. But the kingdom that was being rebuilt was not the same kingdom that had broken, and neither were the two lions who had to rule it. Simba, crowned king alongside Nala in a ceremony watched by the entire Pride, discovered something he had not expected, that victory and legitimacy are not the same thing. His bloodline was unquestionable. Rafiki had anointed him, Mufasa's spirit had spoken from the clouds, and he had defeated Scar with his own claws before the watching lionesses. And yet there was a weight in the eyes of the Pride that no amount of blood right could lift. The lionesses had survived 7 years under Scar because they had learned to survive without a king, because they had organized themselves, hunted together, and kept each other alive through sheer collective will. They had watched Simba arrive from the jungle where he had been living in peace while their children starved. I think that is the unbridgeable thing, that he had been safe while they had not. Nala understood this in a way Simba did not, or perhaps could not, and she carried that understanding like a stone in her chest. She was called the Rebel Queen by the lionesses who had fought beside her, who had stood with her as she spoke truth to Scar's face at Pride Rock, who had seen her emerge from years of covert resistance to claim her place not through birthright, but through bearing witness and refusing silence. Yet the moment she was crowned, something shifted in her own understanding of what that meant. She had not won the right to rule through blood. Simba's line was unquestionable, and hers was not, and the tension of that asymmetry began to show itself almost immediately in the small, quiet moments of governance. When a decision needed to be made about the hunting grounds or the organization of patrols, Simba would defer to her, and she would see the lionesses watching to understand whether she was deferring back or whether she was truly leading. There was no language yet for what they were becoming, not exactly joint rulers, not exactly king and queen in the old sense, but something that neither of them quite knew how to inhabit. Sarabi, who had endured Scar's cruelty and ruled in everything but name for 7 years, offered Nala a kind of quiet guidance in those early weeks, though she was fragile in ways that were not visible unless you looked at her for a long time. She told Nala, in one of those conversations that happens late at night when the pride has settled, that the lionesses would follow her, but that they would also watch to see whether she truly believed in what they had built together, or whether she was simply occupying a role she had never been born to. It is a strange thing to realize that legitimacy cannot be granted, only earned anew every day through the weight of decisions and the willingness to bear their consequences. For Nala, this meant learning to speak in 2 voices at once. The voice of the rebel queen who had organized resistance in secret, and the voice of the future queen she had abandoned in exile years ago. The 2 voices did not always agree. Simba, meanwhile, was learning something else entirely, something that Hakuna Matata had never prepared him for. He had returned to save the kingdom, and he had saved it, and now he had to actually rule it, which meant waking every day in Pride Rock, the place that held his memories of Mufasa's death, the place where Scar had raised him and told him his own grief was his fault, the place he had fled in terror and shame. Every corner of Pride Rock held a ghost. In the shadow of certain rocks, he could still see the moment Mufasa fell. In the gathering places, he could feel the weight of the pride watching him hunt or speak or simply exist in the space where his father had once stood so easily, so surely. The lionesses did not say this out loud, but he could feel them comparing him, in small ways, to the memory of Mufasa, to the king who had been capable and certain, and bound by the circle of life in a way that seemed natural to him. Simba, who had learned in the jungle to question the necessity of that burden, found himself bearing it now with a kind of hollow desperation, trying to convince himself and everyone else that he understood it, that he belonged in it. Nala watched him in those early weeks and saw something that broke her heart, because she loved him still, but differently than she had in exile. Not with the forgetting that Hakuna Matata had allowed, but with the clarity that comes from having lived separate lives and then being forced to inhabit the same space, the same throne, the same impossible weight. She wanted to tell him that he did not have to be Mufasa, that the kingdom did not need him to be certain, that it was enough to be present and aware of the cost of his choices. But she also understood that he was not yet ready to hear that he was still moving through the shock of responsibility, of discovery, of the way that love and duty had finally collapsed into each other. There was Kiara, the cub presented at Pride Rock in the rain, the symbol of renewal and dynastic continuity, and she was beautiful and unmarked by the famine or the violence or the years of Scar's rule. But both Simba and Nala knew that she would grow up in a kingdom shaped by their absence, by the choices they had made, by the lionesses who had survived and the ones who had not, She would grow up knowing that her mother had been a rebel before she was a queen, and that her father had learned to value forgetting before he learned to value remembering. In the early light of those first months, as the Pride lands slowly recovered, and the herds began to tentatively return, Simba and Nala would stand together at the edge of Pride Rock and look out at the kingdom they had inherited and destroyed and saved and were now trying to rebuild. Neither of them felt entirely like a king or entirely like a queen, and they had not yet learned to speak about that unspeakable thing, that sometimes the people who save a kingdom are not entirely sure they are the right people to rule it. But they stood together in the uncertainty, because they had loved each other through exile and separation and impossible choices, and that had to mean something. It had to mean something, even if the meaning was still forming, still tender, still not fully born. The circle of life, which Mufasa had taught Simba to understand as balance and responsibility, would have to be learned again by two rulers who had learned different versions of what life meant, and would have to find a way to weave those different understandings into a kingdom that could survive. It would take time. It would take more than time. It would take a willingness to forgive themselves for the people they had been, for the choices that had consequences beyond their imagining, for the love that had sometimes required them to abandon duty, and the duty that had sometimes required them to abandon love. In the quiet of the night, Nala sometimes still heard the echo of Simba's laughter from the jungle, heard the lightness he had learned to cultivate, and she wondered whether it was possible for either of them to ever truly return to that kind of forgetting, or whether being a ruler meant learning to carry the weight of what they remembered forever. The kingdom was healing. The two lions who held it were learning, slowly and with difficulty, what it meant to heal alongside it. The first year after Scar's fall is not a time of simple triumph, but of a kind of careful, difficult reconstruction that requires the pride to hold two contradictory truths at once, that Simba and Nala were right to return, and that Simba and Nala were wrong to leave. You have to understand, this is not a problem that defeats itself over time, the way some fractures do. It deepens. In the weeks after the rain returns, and the herds begin to trickle back across the savannah, Simba and Nala sit together at the ceremonial stone where young lions are presented, and neither of them can quite look at the other. The lionesses who survived Scar's reign know, in the bone-deep way that suffering teaches you, that Nala's rebellion saved them. They watched her move through the starving months, recruiting quietly, refusing Scar's advances, becoming the focal point of a resistance that looked impossible until it wasn't. And they know equally well that Nala left them 7 years earlier, a young lioness who could have stayed and guided them through darkness, but chose instead to follow a young male into exile. There is no mathematics that resolves this equation. Sarabi, Simba's mother, understands this better than anyone. She spent those 7 years at Pride Rock, enduring Scar's hand across her face and his presence in the throne room, watching the land die around her. In the new reign's first months, she becomes something like a translator between the two impossibilities. The mother who knows why her son had to leave, because she knows what Scar's manipulation felt like, and the witness who knows what it cost the ones who stayed. When Simba asks her, late one night, his voice careful and almost childlike, whether the pride can ever forgive what he and Nala did, Sarabi does not answer quickly. She sits with him in the darkness of Pride Rock, and she tells him something harder than forgiveness. She tells him that the pride does not need to forgive them, because the decision to leave and the decision to stay were never simple. Scar forced both, she says, and the only honest thing to do now is to acknowledge that, rather than expect the ones who endured to absolve the ones who fled. Nala carries this truth differently than Simba does. In her second life as rebel queen, she learned something about power that Simba is still learning, that legitimacy is not given, it is built slowly, through presence and attention and the small choices made every day to show up for the pride. The lionesses who fought under her banner did not follow her because she was heir to the throne. Sarabi had that claim, and it did not move them. They followed her because she chose to be there, in the starving months, in the danger, in the slow accumulation of small resistances. Now that she is queen, this knowledge haunts her. She realizes that the rebellion elevated her partly because she had left and returned, because she could speak to the hunger of the exiled while also bearing witness to the ones who stayed. She has become a symbol of the very contradiction the pride is struggling to hold. In the first year, there are moments when this contradiction threatens to break the kingdom entirely. A lioness named Zira, sister to one who died under Scar's rule, begins to gather followers who believe that Simba and Nala should abdicate, that the pride should be ruled by those who never left. She speaks in the spaces between hunts to the weaker lionesses and the cubs who grew up under starvation, and her message is simple. The ones who saved us are not the ones who should rule us. The argument has a terrible logic to it. Simba learns, through Zazu's careful reports, that there are lionesses in the pride who fought for Scar's overthrow not because they trusted him, but because they could not imagine what Simba and Nala would do once they held power again. For months, this tension lives unresolved in the pride. Simba walks the savannah of the pride lands with new eyes, seeing the bone-pile remnants of the herds his absence allowed to be hunted to near extinction, and he asks himself, over and over, whether he has the right to oversee their recovery. Nala, meanwhile, sits with Sarabi and learns the work of actual queenship, which is not the glory of leading rebellion, but the grinding, patient work of helping one lioness after another learn how to hunt again, how to trust their own strength, how to believe that the land will sustain them when they have spent years watching it die. It is Rafiki who finally speaks the thing that allows the pride to move forward. The mandrill shaman calls Simba and Nala to the sacred place, and in the presence of Mufasa's spirit, communicated in the way that Rafiki communicates with the dead, he tells them something they have been unable to tell themselves. He tells them that the circle of life does not judge who deserves to rule by measuring the purity of their loyalty. It judges by whether they understand that everything is connected, that absence and presence are both part of the pattern, that sometimes the only way to save the kingdom is to leave it, and sometimes the only way to save the kingdom is to stay in the place where everything is breaking. He lifts them before the assembled pride, Rafiki's ancient hands raising them as co-monarchs, not one leading the other, and in that moment something shifts. The pride begins to understand that forgiveness is not the same as absolution, that holding Simba and Nala accountable for their absence does not mean denying their role in Scar's overthrow, that they can love and resent the same people for the same choices, because that is what it means to survive together. By the end of the first year, the land has begun to heal in measurable ways. The herds return in larger numbers, cubs are born, the watering hole runs clear. But the psychological work is slower, and it is not finished. There are still moments when a lioness will refuse to hunt under Simba's direction, or when a young male will question whether bloodline alone grants the right to rule, or when Nala will watch the lionesses defer to her and wonder if they are following her or simply the memory of the rebel queen she became. Simba and Nala do not resolve this between themselves that first year. They do something harder. They learn to make decisions together, to hold the weight of it together, to accept that the pride's forgiveness will be conditional and hard one, and perhaps never quite complete. This is the actual work of legitimacy, and it is less mythic than anyone expected, less pure, more real. They will spend the rest of their reign understanding that returning to rule is not the same as earning the right to rule, that the question of legitimacy is not answered in a single moment, but asked again every day, in the small choices that either deepen or break the trust of those who choose to follow. And perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps a kingdom that asks this question, that resists simple forgiveness, that holds its rulers accountable not just for strength, but for presence and attention, and the willingness to listen to those who paid different prices for survival. Perhaps such a kingdom is stronger, in the end, than one that does not. There is a moment, I think, that every kingdom reaches where it must choose what story it will tell about itself, and what it will do with the people who lived through the breaking of it. Years have passed now since Simba and Nala returned to Pride Rock as joint monarchs, and the Pride lands has healed visibly. The grass has returned, the herds have come back, the circle turns as it was meant to turn. Kiara was born under rain and starlight, and the presentation of the cub at the cliff's edge was celebrated across the savannah as the renewal of the cycle, the promise that what was lost could be restored. And yet, and this is what I keep turning over in my mind, the kingdom they rule is not the same kingdom that was broken. It is better in material ways, fed, ordered, purposeful, guided by two monarchs who understand both the weight of responsibility and the price of refusing it. But something in the lioness's eyes has changed, something in the way they move through Pride Rock that speaks to a knowledge they did not have before Scar's reign. They know what happens when there is no one to resist. They know what it costs to endure. They know that the ones who left came back too late to prevent the bones from littering the grassland, and that knowledge does not simply vanish because victory was eventually achieved. I find myself thinking about this often, the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and whether a kingdom can truly do both at once. Sarabi, Simba's mother, remains the living bridge between those two states, she who endured Scar's hand and Scar's touch, who saw the kingdom crumble from inside Pride Rock and did not break, though the breaking of her took other forms. She moves now with deliberate purpose through the palace she was imprisoned in, and her presence there is both a benediction and a silent testimony. When Simba asks her counsel, she does not offer absolution. She offers understanding of the kind that only comes from having lived through the full weight of consequence. When Nala stands beside him at the waterhole or at the hunting grounds, something unspoken passes between the two monarchs that the pride recognizes as the cost of their joint legitimacy. Nala was the rebel queen, the one who organized resistance in shadow and emerged to speak truth against propaganda. The lionesses followed her not because of bloodright, but because she understood their hunger, their desperation, their capacity to endure together. Simba was the absent heir who returned with Rafiki's blessing and Mufasa's ghost still echoing in his blood, carrying the weight of his father's legacy and his own guilt like stones in his chest. Neither is quite comfortable calling themselves simply king or queen. Neither knows if the pride views them as saviors or as the ones who should have been there all along, and that uncertainty is written into every decision they make together. I think about the lionesses who were not there when they returned, the cubs who starved in the dry season, the mothers who did not have milk to give, the hunters who fell to hyena teeth or simple exhaustion. Their bones fertilized the grassland that grows now so green and abundant, and the kingdom feeds itself on their absence, transforms their deaths into the prosperity that allows Kiara to play at the cliff's edge without fear. Is that mercy, or is that cruelty? Is it the circle of life, or is it the cost of choosing love over duty, and then choosing duty over love, and finally choosing both only when both could no longer save everyone? What I cannot stop noticing is how rarely anyone speaks of this directly in the pride's presence. The story has solidified into something acceptable. Scar was evil, Simba and Nala were right to return, the kingdom has been saved, the circle turns as it should. And all of that is true. But there is another truth that lives underneath it, in the spaces between what is said and what is remembered. The kingdom survived not because two lovers chose each other over duty, but because one of them eventually chose duty even at the cost of the other, and the other eventually chose duty at the cost of 7 years of willful forgetting. The lionesses followed Nala not because she had bloodright, but because she understood that sometimes the only way to lead is to first endure, to first bear witness, to first refuse to accept the story you are told about your own powerlessness. Simba learned that sometimes the only way to honor your father is to accept that you are not your father, that the weight of being king is different when you have chosen exile and had to choose return, that the circle of life does not absolve you of the choice to participate in it. There is a young lioness named Zira. I mention her because the story does not end here, because the kingdom is larger and more complex than any single narrative of redemption, who has begun to gather followers who believe that those who left should not rule those who stayed, that the ones who endured Scar's reign have a claim that bloodright and rebellion cannot overcome. Simba and Nala are aware of this gathering discord, and instead of silencing it, they have chosen to allow it to be spoken, to be witnessed, to be answered not with force but with presence. This is perhaps their greatest gift to the kingdom, the understanding that a pride that cannot speak its divisions is a pride that will eventually shatter under the weight of silence. When Nala stands with Sarabi and they discuss the complicated legitimacy of their rule, when Simba sits with Rafiki and speaks of the visions that still sometimes visit him in the deep night, when the two monarchs gather the pride and acknowledge that both those who left and those who stayed were failed by the same catastrophe, something in the kingdom shifts. It does not become easy. It does not become simple. But it becomes honest, and honesty is the only foundation on which trust can be rebuilt. I think about the bond between Simba and Nala often, how it shaped the fate of the entire kingdom, how their choice to leave created a vacuum that Scar filled, how their eventual return was necessary but never sufficient to undo all that the vacancy had wrought. They love each other still. That is clear in the way they move together, the way their eyes find each other across the gathering ground, the way they have learned to rule not as individuals but as a unit, each understanding the other's different kind of absence and different kind of survival. But they also know that their love, precious as it is not the whole story of the Pride Lands. It is one story among many, the story of Sarabi's endurance, the story of the lioness's resistance, the story of Zazu's double life in the skull cage, the story of every creature who lived and died under Scar's rule. Their bond is woven into the fabric of the kingdom, but the kingdom is larger than any single bond, and it carries the weight of all the choices that were made and all the cost that was paid for those choices to lead somewhere at all. And so they rule together, and the Pride Lands prospers, and the grass grows where bones once lay,